Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. Story 1, The Circle in the Dark. I had always liked the woods in autumn. There was a crispness to the air that made breathing feel pure, and the way the sunlight fractured through the thinning canopy reminded me, almost absurdly, of stained glass. I had hiked this particular stretch of the Pine Hollow Trail countless times in the past, but something about that late October afternoon had drawn me further in than usual. Perhaps it was the silence, or the subtle way the wind moved through the treetops, carrying scents of damp earth and decaying leaves. Whatever it was, I welcomed it. I carried my backpack, the familiar weight comforting, and my tent was neatly folded at my side, a portable bubble of solitude waiting to be deployed. I arrived at a small clearing just as the sun was beginning its slow descent. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, surrounded on three sides by thick stands of pine and birch, the fourth opening to a babbling creek that reflected the muted gold of the sky. I pitched my tent quickly, using the well-practiced motions that had become second nature over the years. Each peg I hammered into the soil, each cord I tightened, was reassuringly tangible, grounding me in the ordinary mechanics of survival. As I worked, I noticed how still the woods were. Usually, even on the quietest day, there would be birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, or the low rustle of deer through the underbrush. But here, there was only the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. It was a silence that seemed to press in, like the air itself was listening. I shook it off, attributing the stillness to the late hour. Once the tent was set, I unpacked my sleeping bag, arranged my gear neatly, and started a small fire, the smell of burning pine filling my nostrils. I boiled water for dinner, ate in relative solitude, and then settled into the small cocoon of the tent with a book. Night was falling fast now, and the last pale light of the sun bled through the thin fabric of the tent walls, turning the interior a faint, sickly orange. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. I dozed off intermittently, half listening to the fire crackle and the creek's distant murmur. It was around midnight when I woke suddenly, a small sense of unease prickling at the back of my neck. The tent was still warm, the fire reduced to a bed of glowing embers outside. But I felt watched. It wasn't the rational fear of being alone in the woods, it was sharper, more insistent. I unzipped the tent flap slowly, peering into the darkness. The clearing was bathed in moonlight now, silver and fragile. That was when I saw them, footprints. Not just one set, but many, forming a perfect circle around my tent, the soil still soft enough that each indentation was clear. My stomach lurched. The prints were large, human, but precise in a way that seemed unnatural. I thought of hikers, hunters, lost wanderers, but the circle, that implied deliberation, intention. I swallowed, trying to force calm into my voice as I whispered to myself. Probably just deer. Maybe raccoons. But my eyes didn't lie. The prints were definitely human. I stepped out into the cold night, the dew already soaking through my shoes. The wind was still, heavy and expectant. I followed the tracks around the tent, counting each step. The circle was perfect, a geometric precision that no drunken wanderer could manage. Yet when I looked closer, when I scanned the surrounding woods, there was no one. Not a shadow, not a rustle. Nothing. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks. The moonlight cast strange angles through the trees, elongating shadows, stretching branches into grotesque shapes. But the footprints didn't lie. They were real. They were here. And they had circled me while I slept. I returned to the tent, heart hammering, and zipped the flap closed. I double-checked the stakes, the cords, even the fire pit, though there was no rational reason to expect it to matter. I tried to read my book, but each sentence dissolved into a fog of anxiety. The air felt heavier now, the silence around me loaded with expectation, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes, it was hard to tell. Every small sound set my nerves on edge, the creaks whispering, the snap of a twig somewhere distant, the faint scuff of what might have been a branch brushing against the undergrowth. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if something or someone was out there. Every time I peeked through the flap, the footprints had not changed, but a creeping, irrational fear told me I was no longer alone. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping, circling my tent. My heart stopped. I pressed my ear to the canvas, straining to hear. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, slow. It stopped. The night returned to its oppressive silence. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but the pattern of the noise, the deliberate pacing, it felt intelligent. Watching. Waiting. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight, my mind racing with rational explanations I couldn't quite grasp. I forced myself to zip the tent halfway open and shone the beam into the clearing. The light fell on the circle of footprints. Again, no one. No movement. Nothing but the moonlight and the broken geometry of the soil. Sleep, if it came at all, was fitful. Dreams were filled with the pressure of eyes in the dark, silhouettes moving just beyond vision, and the constant whisper of soil shifting under feet that weren't there. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, I emerged cautiously. The footprints were gone. Vanished, as though they had never existed. I packed hastily, keeping my eyes peeled for anything, branches bent, a glint of metal, signs of life, but found nothing. The woods seemed empty, benign in the morning light, the kind of peace that made rationality seem convincing again. Perhaps it had been a prank, a hallucination, some odd alignment of shadows and earth. Perhaps. And yet, as I walked the trail back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, not in the woods, but waiting. Something patient. Something that knew I had noticed. I never camped alone again. I tried to convince myself the footprints had been a one-off, an odd prank or a trick of the night, but the memory of that perfect circle haunted me. Even during mundane tasks, making coffee, driving home, checking my phone, the image of the soil pressed into deliberate, human shapes lingered. Something about that precision had bypassed reason and lodged itself in the part of my mind that recognized threats before the conscious brain could articulate them. I would wake in the middle of the night, the memory vivid, my body stiff with tension, convinced I could hear faint scraping outside my bedroom window. Weeks later, the restlessness became unbearable. I couldn't shake the thought that the woods hadn't released me completely. Compulsively, almost irrationally, I found myself returning. I had an itch in the marrow of my bones that needed scratching, the need to understand what had happened. I convinced myself that revisiting the clearing during the day would dissolve the fear, that daylight, reason, and rational thought would expose the truth. There had been no circle, no one circling me while I slept. The drive back into Pine Hollow was quiet, almost too quiet. The trees, once familiar, seemed taller, denser, their boughs leaning closer to the road than memory allowed. The sunlight struggled through the canopy, filtering in dusty shafts that made the forest floor appear like a painting in negative, the shadows too dark, the light too fragile. I parked at the trailhead, the gravel crunching under my boots in an unnervingly loud cadence, and shouldered my pack. The clearing was unchanged. At first glance, it seemed peaceful, serene, the kind of scene one might paint on a postcard. The creek murmured, leaves rustled in a gentle breeze, birds called in distant voices. But the moment I stepped into the center, the hair along the back of my neck rose. Something had shifted. The soil bore marks, not footprints exactly, but impressions, shallow depressions that radiated outward in irregular patterns. I bent closer, heart thundering. They were small, subtle, almost delicate, like someone had traced fingers along the earth. My skin prickled. I stepped back, telling myself it was the wind, a deer scratching against the ground, anything but human. I camped that night, a new tent in the same clearing. I kept my flashlight close, double-checked the stakes, and even set small twigs around the perimeter to act as early warning systems if anything approached. I told myself it was excessive, irrational, but my hand shook as I arranged everything, the memory of the circle refusing to be dismissed. I ate quickly and crawled into the sleeping bag, trying to read a book to occupy my mind. It started just after midnight. A scraping, soft at first, then more deliberate. I froze, listening as the sound circled my tent, matching the rhythm of the footprints from weeks before. My pulse raced. I gripped the flashlight, my fingers cold and trembling, as I unzipped the flap. Outside, the clearing appeared empty, illuminated by a thin crescent moon. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, and for a moment I convinced myself it was my imagination. Then I saw them. A second circle, human footprints this time, pressed into the damp soil in perfect alignment with my tent. I counted them slowly, my stomach twisting. 22 steps. Each step angled precisely to form a circle identical to the one I remembered. There was no one there. Nothing moved. But I could feel the presence, the expectation of something observing me. I ran through every rational explanation, hikers passing by, hunters setting traps, some local prankster with a sinister sense of humor. But every argument fell apart the moment I looked closer. The prints were too deliberate, too clean, as though someone had walked carefully, methodically, aware of every step. They didn't lead away, they circled endlessly, always returning to the same point, leaving the same impression, that they had never intended to leave. Panic clawed at my chest. I stumbled backward into the tent, slamming the zipper closed. My flashlight illuminated the interior, bouncing light across the fabric walls. The shadows seemed to swell and twist, becoming long, distorted figures that pressed against the thin canvas. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. My rational mind screamed that I was alone, but every fiber of my being told me I wasn't. I slept in fits, waking constantly at the faintest noise, the soft scraping returning with almost surgical precision. I tried reasoning with myself. I had imagined the first set, but the second. No! That could not be imagined. I lay frozen, eyes wide, listening to the cadence of something pacing just beyond the walls, waiting, studying. By dawn, I was exhausted, trembling, and pale. I could no longer pretend the woods were benign. They had a will. They had memory. They had me. The decision to leave came with a mixture of relief and dread. I packed swiftly, refusing to look around, my movements frantic, almost desperate. But before I could step out of the clearing, I noticed something chilling, small handprints, pressed lightly into the soil outside the tent's edge, trailing away into the forest. They weren't human, or if they were distorted, twisted in a way that made no anatomical sense. Fingers too long, palms too narrow, yet undeniably deliberate. My stomach churned. I fled, stumbling along the trail, backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The forest seemed alive in a new way, the branches clawing at me as I ran, the shadows stretching and curling into grotesque shapes. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The path twisted and shifted in ways I hadn't remembered. Even with my compass, the trail seemed unfamiliar, warped, as though the woods themselves were rearranging to prevent my escape. When I finally stumbled out onto the road, heart hammering, lungs burning, I dared a glance behind me. The clearing was gone. In its place, the forest loomed, normal, undisturbed, almost serene. No footprints. No handprints. Nothing but the quiet murmur of leaves in the wind. I never returned to Pine Hollow. Yet sometimes, late at night, I dream of circles in the dirt, of soft scraping outside my tent, and I feel the eyes always watching, always waiting. And I know, somehow, that the woods never forget. I thought avoiding the woods would be enough, but it wasn't. I tried to resume normal life, work, errands, friends, but the memory of those circles haunted me in quiet moments. The thought of the prints, the deliberate pacing, the distorted handprints invaded every corner of my mind. I refused to tell anyone. The words seemed absurd. How do you explain footprints circling an empty tent? How do you convey the sensation of being watched by something that isn't there? Rationality faltered, leaving only the gnawing fear that I had left a part of myself behind in Pine Hollow. Weeks turned into months. I avoided camping entirely, kept to crowded trails, and slept with lights on. Yet, the unease never fully subsided. Then came the call. It was a text from an unknown number. You left something behind. It remembers. My stomach dropped. My first instinct was disbelief. Some prank, surely. But the words carried weight, a cold certainty I could not rationalize away. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. Another text arrived, seconds later. It's hungry. Panic propelled me into action. I changed my number, avoided the area entirely, and even contacted the authorities, though I knew they would do nothing. They couldn't. Nobody could. The sense of being watched grew daily, subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow just beyond the edge of a room. At night, I slept poorly, haunted by dreams of soil, circles, and a slow, deliberate scraping that always came closer. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing at the window, staring at the trees behind my apartment building. The city lights dulled the darkness, but I swore I saw shapes moving between the trunks, figures too thin, too precise to be human. A memory surged unbidden, the perfect circle, the handprints, the scraping at midnight. My chest tightened. I had ignored it for too long. Whatever it was, it followed me. I packed my essentials with trembling hands. I couldn't stay, not here, not anywhere. I left the apartment, drove for hours, eventually ending up at a small, isolated motel. I kept my distance from anyone, any place, anything that reminded me of the woods. I slept with all lights blazing, checked every corner of the room, and still, the unease lingered. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. I had stopped at a rest area to grab coffee in the early morning, the highway nearly empty. The wind carried an earthy smell, wet soil, pine, and something acrid I couldn't place. I froze. There, pressed into the asphalt, was a perfect circle. Footprints. Not dirt, not mud, clean, black impressions, yet unmistakably human. The circle was small, precise, and utterly deliberate, just like the ones in the clearing. My legs locked. I couldn't move. My mind screamed denial. And then I saw it, the first figure. Thin, elongated, hands that stretched unnaturally to the ground. Its head tilted at a wrong angle, eyes too dark, too empty. It stepped into the circle, then moved again, pacing exactly as I had seen in my tent. Around it, shadows bent and twisted, as if reality itself obeyed its movement. My rational brain tried to reject an optical illusion, a trick of the light, my imagination, but the instinctive knowledge of the woods returned. This was not human. This was not natural. I ran. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as my pulse pounded in my ears. Behind me, the sound followed, scraping, rhythmic, deliberate. I glanced back briefly. 2 more figures had appeared, pacing the circles like sentinels. The asphalt beneath them seemed to darken unnaturally, their shadows stretching impossibly long, almost reaching toward me. I drove without thought, without direction, only away, the figures trailing at the edges of my vision. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the circles multiplied hundreds, perhaps thousands, stretching back down the highway, all containing those elongated, wrong figures. They didn't run, they didn't chase in the conventional sense. They simply waited, marking the path, ensuring I understood. I could flee, but I could not escape the attention I had drawn. Weeks later, I found a cabin for sale far from the forested areas I knew. Isolated, rural, surrounded by flat farmland rather than trees. I purchased it sight unseen, desperate for distance, for some semblance of safety. I never camped again. I never went into the woods. For months, there were no sightings, no signs. I told myself it had been a warning, a lesson, perhaps even a residual hallucination from my panicked mind. I allowed myself a fragile sense of normalcy. But one night, lying in bed, I smelled it again, damp earth, pine, something acrid beneath it, unmistakably alive. And then I heard the faintest sound, scraping, circling my home, deliberate and slow. I knew then with absolute certainty that it had followed me. Not the forest, not the trail, but it. Patient, observant, endless. I will never leave my cabin at night. I will never sleep with the lights off. But I know it watches. Always. Circling, patient, silent except for the faint scrape of its presence on the earth. And I know, without doubt, that one day it will reach me. I don't know how long I have. But I do know this, the circle will close. Story 2, Echoes in the Factory. I never imagined that working the night shift would change me, not just subtly, but in ways that would haunt every quiet hour of my life afterward. I started the job out of necessity, factories always paid, and the night shift had fewer eyes watching, fewer rules enforced. It was a large industrial building on the outskirts of the city, isolated by overgrown weeds and rusting fencing. The streets leading to it were empty most nights, broken only by the hum of distant traffic or the occasional flicker of a passing car. I remember thinking, as I pulled my coat tighter against the chill clinging to the windows, that it suited me perfectly, solitude, silence, and the monotony of machines. The first nights were easy. I learned the layout, the cavernous assembly hall with machines frozen in dim fluorescent light, the office rooms that smelled faintly of mildew and printer ink, and the long corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. I would sit at the control panels, adjusting pressures, monitoring gauges, and walking the floor to ensure nothing had gone haywire. Sometimes, the clatter of machines echoed too sharply, bouncing off walls in ways that made me flinch. I rationalized it: old building, old metal, nothing more. The unsettling part began slowly, almost imperceptibly. It started with a sound, a faint tap, like a shoe scuffing concrete. I would pause mid-step, listening, but the halls were empty, the machines humming steadily. I told myself it was rats or a loose pipe vibrating. But the sound persisted, always behind me. Sometimes it lasted only a few seconds, fading as soon as I turned my head. Other times it lingered, dragging its pace deliberately, mocking my rationality. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, letting exhaustion warp perception. But then came the nights when the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, distinct, slow, and heavy. They didn't match my rhythm. They followed me even when I doubled back, quickened when I paused. My heartbeat thudded in my chest as the line between rational thought and paranoia blurred. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting shadows long and monstrous against the walls. Sometimes, I could swear the shadows moved differently from me, lagging behind for a split second too long. I remember trying to call security, but my phone had no signal, and the walkie-talkie in the control room was dead, both batteries drained. Rationality clung to explanations, echoes, drafts, faulty acoustics. Yet the primal part, the part that senses danger before the brain registers it, screamed I was not alone. That week, other details appeared. Doors that should have been locked were slightly ajar. A chair faced the wrong way. Tools were moved from their racks. Nothing definitive, nothing convincing to anyone else, but enough to gnaw at my sanity. Each night I double-checked locks, walked corridors repeatedly, listening, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The factory became a labyrinth of fear, and I its prisoner. One night, after adjusting conveyors in the assembly hall, I paused to check my watch. It was 2:43 a.m., the deepest hour of silence. Then it started again, the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing perfectly with the factory's layout. I spun, flashlight cutting arcs through the shadows, and saw something impossible. The office doors, steel and padlocked for months, rattled slightly, as if someone or something was testing them. My rational mind protested, wind, mechanical anomaly, but my eyes said otherwise. The rattling stopped abruptly as my breath hitched. Silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against my eardrums. I told myself I had to keep moving. To stop was to invite panic. Step by step, I crossed the hall, every nerve screaming. Then I heard a whisper. Low, gravelly, almost a sigh, right behind me. My skin crawled. I risked a glance backward and saw nothing but darkness. No shadows, no movement, just an empty hall. My legs moved of their own accord, faster now, racing for the control room where monitors and cameras should have reassured me. Yet as I approached, the screens were black, every single one. No camera feed, no light. A cold sweat drenched my back. The footsteps resumed, faster this time, circling me, echoing in perfect imitation of my own panicked steps. I could feel them pressing in, the air thickening, my breath loud in my ears. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief, horrifying instant, I glimpsed a figure, tall, unnaturally elongated, dissolving into the shadows as I blinked. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was a trick of light, yet the instinct to run overpowered all logic. I never got to the control room that night. I bolted for the main exit, heart hammering, lungs burning. The padlocked doors refused to yield, and when I turned, I realized the footsteps had stopped. Silence crashed around me like a wave, heavy, oppressive, almost tactile. But then, softly, right behind my ear, a whisper, the words indistinct but terrifyingly intimate, "Don't leave." I ran. The next night, I couldn't bring myself to return to the factory, yet I knew I had no choice. Bills, rent, the quiet desperation that gnawed at me like a rat, all of it drove me back. I arrived under the same indifferent streetlights, the fence leaning and the weeds crawling higher than the last time I'd seen them. The building looked smaller somehow, as if it had shrunk overnight, pressing down on the street, daring me to enter. My stomach knotted as I turned the key in the lock, the sound echoing inside the cavernous hall like a gunshot. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the tang of machinery. The fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, their flicker inconsistent, more pronounced than before. Every step I took was an invitation to the echoes I dreaded. The corridors seemed longer now, the shadows deeper. I kept my flashlight close, its beam trembling in my grip, cutting narrow swaths through the darkness. Every sound was amplified, metal tapping against metal, my boots on concrete, the low hum of machines idling in the shadows. It started quietly, almost innocuously. I heard a faint scraping behind me, like a chair being dragged across the floor. I froze, breath shallow. The scraping stopped. I shook my head and muttered to myself, "Get a grip. You're imagining things." I continued my rounds, slower now, nerves taut. But the sensation persisted, something following, something patient, waiting for me to falter. As I moved deeper into the building, I noticed changes I hadn't seen before. A ladder leaned against a wall that had never had one. A toolbox lay open, its contents scattered in a way I was sure I hadn't left them. The office doors along the hall, previously padlocked, now hummed slightly ajar. The rational part of me, desperate, pleading, tried to offer explanations. Maintenance workers, the building settling, drafts. But every instinct I had screamed that none of these could account for the weight in the air, the way the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The footsteps returned, heavier this time, more deliberate. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their rhythm matching mine, sometimes anticipating, sometimes lagging just behind. I tested my theory, doubling back, spinning around abruptly, but each movement was mirrored by the sound. It was no longer a question of imagination. Someone, or something, was moving in the dark, invisible but impossible to ignore. I tried calling for help, shouting into the emptiness, my voice bouncing back at me distorted. Silence answered. Even the machines seemed to have stopped, their hum replaced by the oppressive stillness that had been pressing in around me since I first heard the steps. I stumbled toward a side corridor, hoping to reach the office area where the cameras, if functioning, would offer reassurance. Then I saw it. A shadow detaching from the corner of the hall, long, grotesque, stretching impossibly toward the ceiling before dissolving when I blinked. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped. I knew, without rational thought, that turning and running wouldn't matter. It was everywhere I was, or at least seemed to be. The footsteps accelerated, overlapping my own, echoing from all directions at once. Panic clawed at my chest, hot and suffocating. I ran blindly, arms outstretched, feeling walls, doors, anything familiar. The corridor twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I stumbled through a doorway and found myself in a small storage room I was certain didn't exist on the factory's floor plan. Shelves loomed like dark sentinels, boxes stacked precariously. My flashlight illuminated dust motes swirling in the thick, stagnant air, yet even in that narrow room, I could hear them, footsteps pacing outside, circling, testing the barriers. Desperation drove me to the only option I could think of. I shoved a heavy metal cabinet against the door and pressed myself against the wall, chest heaving, heart hammering so hard I feared it might burst. The footsteps paused. Silence again. My mind screamed at me to stay calm, to breathe, to think rationally. But rationality was useless here. I felt something pressing on the other side of the door, a presence so oppressive it seemed to warp the air. The door shuddered under a weight, and a sound like a low growl emanated from the other side. I don't know how long I stayed there, listening to my own ragged breathing, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. Eventually, I forced myself to the corner of the room, edging toward the back exit I had seen on the emergency map. The footsteps resumed, softer now, circling the room as if testing its boundaries. And then I realized something far worse. They weren't outside. They were inside, somewhere behind me, in the shadows I couldn't illuminate. I spun around, flashlight cutting desperate arcs through the room. Nothing. The room was empty, shelves and boxes unchanged. Yet the air itself seemed thicker, heavier, pressing in from all sides. I tried to call for help again, my voice cracking. The whisper came then, soft, almost affectionate in tone, "You can't leave." It seemed to echo from the walls themselves, vibrating through my skull. My stomach churned with nausea, my limbs frozen with terror. I knew then that the factory had changed. It was no longer just a building, no longer just metal and concrete. It had become something else, something alive, aware, and predatory. I backed toward the emergency exit, fumbling with the lock, shaking so badly I could barely turn the handle. Behind me, the footsteps quickened, matching every shudder, every jerk of my body. The whisper repeated, insistent now, "Stay." I pulled with all my strength. The door resisted, groaning, almost as if the building itself was holding it closed. The footsteps surged closer, more solid, more present. I yanked again, and the lock gave way. I tumbled out into the cold night air, gasping, lungs burning. The factory loomed behind me, silent, dark, watching. I didn't stop running until the streetlights of the city were a block behind me. Only then did I allow myself to collapse on the pavement, chest heaving, drenched in sweat, certain I had escaped. But even as I lay there, trembling, I knew the truth. It had followed me, in some way, through the darkness, waiting for the night when I returned. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark corridors, the flickering lights, and the shadows stretching impossibly along the walls. I thought of the whisper, low and intimate, the way it seemed to echo in my skull. You can't leave. Stay. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that the exhaustion and fear had combined to create a hallucination. But when the morning came and I returned to the factory, out of obligation, curiosity, or sheer madness, I found it different. Not in appearance, but in presence. The gates were still closed, the weeds still crawling, yet the building seemed alive, almost waiting. My keys rattled as I unlocked the main door. Inside, the air felt thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. The fluorescent lights flickered unevenly, humming in a way that pressed against my skull. I tried to breathe normally, tried to focus on tasks, but the sense of being watched, of being hunted, had grown heavier. I started my rounds in the assembly hall, flashlights slicing through darkness. Machines hummed in low monotones, but it wasn't their sound that made my stomach twist, it was the silence in between. Each step I took seemed amplified, bouncing off the walls in ways that betrayed a presence, a rhythm, a consciousness following me. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate thump behind me. My head snapped around. Nothing. I shook it off and continued, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps echoing mine, yet off, asynchronous, deliberate. I froze, every nerve screaming. My flashlight trembled in my hand. The corridor stretched unnaturally, twisting in ways it hadn't before, leading me deeper into the factory than I had ever gone. I reached the office area, heart hammering, hoping for cameras, hoping for reassurance. But the screens were blank, dead. Panic set in fully. I could hear the steps circling, faster now, omnipresent, echoing from the walls themselves. Then I realized it, there was no shadow, no figure. The presence was everywhere, intangible, pressing in from all sides. I backed into a corner, flashlight swinging wildly. The whisper returned, closer now, directly in my ear. You can't hide. The breath of it brushed my skin, warm and wet, and my stomach lurched. I spun, trying to locate it, but the room was empty. My chest burned, limbs trembling as sweat poured from me. Every instinct screamed to run, but I was trapped by the maze-like corridors that seemed to shift with each step. Desperation overtook rational thought. I ran blindly, crashing into doors, shelves, and machinery. The steps followed perfectly, anticipating my movements. I stumbled into a storage room, slamming the door behind me. Boxes loomed like silent judges, casting shadows that danced with the flickering light. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the flashlight as if it could protect me. The air thickened, vibrating with low, almost imperceptible murmurs. The footsteps pressed against the door, slow at first, then faster, heavier, pounding with a weight I could almost feel. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. Then it whispered again, intimate, patient, you belong here. My blood ran cold. The rational part of my mind, the part that had clung to explanations, snapped. This was no trick, no machine anomaly. This was something alive, something aware, and it was hungry for fear. I knew then that there was no normal exit. The building itself had changed. The corridors twisted impossibly, doors appeared and disappeared, and the shadows no longer followed predictable patterns. My flashlight flickered, and in that instant, I glimpsed it, tall, impossibly thin, limbs stretching at unnatural angles, dissolving into darkness when I blinked. It didn't move, the room itself seemed to bend around it, and yet I felt its gaze burn through me. I ran again, groping for any exit. The storage room's door yielded under my push, and I stumbled into the main hall. The machines hummed now, louder, their vibrations syncing with the presence around me. I ran toward the main exit, my hands clawing at the padlock, the metal biting into my skin. The footsteps surged behind me, faster, heavier, anticipating each movement. The whisper returned, this time everywhere, inside my skull, pressing against my temples. You can't leave. Never leave. I yanked at the padlock with every ounce of strength. The door gave way. I fell out into the cold night, gasping, lungs burning, heart hammering like a drum. I ran without looking back, straight into the empty streets, until the distant city lights swallowed me. I thought I had escaped. For a moment, the factory became just a building again, inert and silent. But as I collapsed on the curb, trembling and soaked in sweat, I knew the truth. It had followed me, in some way, through the darkness, into the night. And it would wait, always, for the moment I returned. I didn't return to the factory for 3 nights. I couldn't. Sleep was impossible, every shadow in my apartment bending into corridors I knew only too well, every creak in the floorboards sounding like footsteps following me. But I couldn't ignore it forever. Bills piled up, and the job was my only way to survive. When I finally stepped toward the building again, it was with a sense of dread I had never known, the cold seeping through my coat and straight into my bones. The streetlights along the factory's edge flickered in time with my heartbeat. The building looked the same, yet wrong. The overgrown weeds pressed closer, almost as if they were reaching for me. Every instinct screamed to turn around and run, but I had a plan this time, a plan rooted in logic, however fragile it felt. I would confront it, map its behavior, and escape if possible. Inside, the air was thick, stale, and metallic. I moved cautiously, flashlight in hand, scanning the assembly hall, the corridors, the office spaces. The shadows clung to corners and ceilings unnaturally, moving when I didn't. I counted my steps, tried to measure distance, tested patterns, trying to understand the entity that haunted me. Footsteps began again, slow at first, deliberate, echoing perfectly behind me. I froze. Every instinct screamed terror, yet I pressed forward, rationality my shield. Then I noticed it, a faint heat along the walls, a vibration under my feet, subtle at first, then intensifying. The entity wasn't just following, it was aware of my actions, adjusting, shaping the environment, bending the building around me. Rational explanations failed utterly. I realized that it existed in the space itself, in the hallways, in the air. I felt trapped, a fly in a maze designed by something patient and intelligent. I decided to test it. I ran in a zigzag, doubling back unexpectedly, hoping to confuse it. The footsteps responded immediately, matching each turn, each falter. Panic surged, hot and raw, but the whisper came again, soft, intimate, omnipresent, you belong here. It wasn't just words, it was an intent, a force pressing against me. I realized then that the building and the presence were one. Escape wasn't about doors, it was about breaking the pattern, defying the entity itself. I ran blindly toward the assembly hall, where the old machinery lined up like silent judges. The fluorescent lights flickered violently. I pushed a metal cart in front of me, slamming it against a support beam, hoping to create a barrier, an obstacle. The footsteps didn't stop. I realized it wasn't obeying physics. It existed in perception, in fear, in expectation. I shouted, a primal roar of defiance, demanding it release me, demanding reality reclaim me. And then I did something I hadn't considered possible. I stopped. Completely. Stood perfectly still. The footsteps approached, slow now, almost tentative. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the darkness. The whisper circled me, closer, everywhere at once. Don't move, you can't leave. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I let my mind reach a single, undeniable truth. Fear gives it power. The entity hesitated. The air shifted, heavy, almost viscous. And then, faintly, impossibly, I felt the building release me, not fully, but enough. The footsteps receded, the whispers faded, leaving the air hollow. I didn't move immediately, only breathing, listening. Then, slowly, I backed toward the main exit, careful, measured, eyes never leaving the darkness behind me. The padlocked door loomed ahead. I pressed my hands against it, and this time it opened without resistance. I ran outside into the cold night, lungs burning, muscles screaming, not daring to look back. The factory stood silent behind me, inert, lifeless, or at least appearing so. I didn't stop until the city lights swallowed me, until the sounds of normal life filled my ears. I never returned. Not in the night, not in the day. I moved cities, changed jobs, changed routines. But I carry the memory, the heat in the walls, the whisper in my skull, the footsteps that existed even when no one was there. I survived, yes, and in that survival, I understood something I will never forget. Fear is tangible, and some buildings are alive in ways we cannot comprehend. The factory remains, somewhere on the outskirts, waiting. But I am free, if only because I learned that fear obeys the mind that refuses it. I survived the night. I left the factory behind. But sometimes, when the wind presses against the walls of buildings, or the shadows stretch a little too long, I hear it again, the whisper, faint but undeniable, don't leave. And I remember. Story 3, The Night Car. I never thought of myself as paranoid. I lived on Cedar Street, a bustling avenue lined with small cafes, independent shops, and apartment buildings with bright windows that made the nights feel safe, even in winter. My apartment was on the second floor of a brick building, the kind that smelled faintly of damp wood and old heating pipes. I liked it because it was ordinary, predictable. I liked routine, coffee at 7:15, the same bench at the park at noon, a book before bed. It was that routine that made the first oddity so unsettling. The first night it happened, I noticed the car parked across the street while I was making my tea. It was black, an older model sedan with a dull finish that absorbed streetlight rather than reflecting it. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars stopped outside all the time. But when I stepped onto the balcony later, cigarette in hand, it was still there. Headlights off, engine silent. The street hummed with the distant rumble of traffic, dogs barking, the occasional shout. Yet this one car remained, like it was waiting. I rationalized it. Maybe the owner worked late at the cafe 2 blocks down. Maybe they were visiting someone nearby. I went inside, telling myself that noticing it twice in one evening didn't mean anything. The hum of the refrigerator, the warm light over the kitchen sink, the soft clatter of dishes felt reassuring. But then, when I looked out my window an hour later, it hadn't moved. Not a single inch. The next day, I kept my mind busy. Work, emails, phone calls. By evening, the dread had receded slightly, a shadow at the edges of my mind rather than a presence. But it was back again, black as before, parked across the street. I checked my watch. It was well past 11. I noticed the street was unusually quiet. Usually, even at that hour, headlights streak the pavement, tires hiss along wet asphalt, someone slams a car door. But now, There was only the car. I started taking notes. I know how it sounds silly, obsessive, but I wrote down times, positions, any details I could catch. License plate partially obscured by dirt. Tires a little worn. Inside, I thought I saw a figure, but when I blinked, nothing. Just the empty car. Some nights, I convinced myself the shape was a trick of shadows, reflections of the street lamp in the window of my apartment. But other nights, I could swear I saw someone inside, sitting perfectly still, head turned towards my window. Sleep grew uneasy. I lay in bed and imagined it across the street, engine running, waiting, someone behind the wheel tracing my movements with precise patience. My dreams were fragments of the car, it driving slowly past my window, headlights flashing briefly, a low horn sound echoing just before I woke with my heart hammering. I tried closing curtains, drawing blinds, locking the door, even unplugging the apartment intercom to feel a barrier between myself and the outside world. Nothing mattered. The next night, the car was back. I told myself it was stress. Work was piling up, bills, emails that never seemed to end. I was overthinking. Yet, each evening, it was worse. The car didn't just appear, it lingered. I started noticing patterns, headlights reflecting faintly in puddles, the way shadows stretched oddly beneath the trees, the absence of any sound from inside the car. It seemed to absorb sound. The world around it went on, the occasional pedestrian, the far-off wail of sirens, but right there, in that small stretch of asphalt, time felt suspended. Then came the smell. Not always, but sometimes, as I drew the curtains aside, a faint odor of something metallic, iron, or perhaps burnt rubber drifted up. It wasn't from traffic. Other cars passed, engines humming, exhausted, punctuating the night. Only the black car seemed to exude that scent. I tried rational explanations. Maybe the brakes were overheating. Maybe someone had left food rotting inside. But the thought that some internal source could be so persistent, so invasive, felt wrong. I started taking photographs, blurry ones through the window, grainy captures of the street at midnight. Each time, the camera refused to focus on the car. Shadows, trees, streetlight glints, all clear, but the car always came out hazy, as if it resisted being documented. I laughed nervously at myself in the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, thinking I was losing it. Ordinary people don't keep staring at a car at midnight, do they? And yet, every time I thought I convinced myself it wasn't real, I'd see it again, still, silent, waiting. One night, I got braver. I went downstairs and out the front door. My apartment was on the second floor, so I had to climb the steps slowly, listening for anything that might reveal a presence inside or nearby. The street was empty. Just the usual hum of distant traffic. But as I approached the car, I noticed the engine was off, no interior light on, no movement. And yet, the windows were fogged from the inside breath. I pressed my hand against the cold metal. It was dead, lifeless. I circled it once, twice, checking the doors. Locked, no key in sight. I laughed again, shakily, and muttered to myself about imagination, paranoia, urban legends, whatever the rational mind clings to when it wants to survive a night. I walked back up the steps, peered back at the street. The car was gone. My heart slowed. Maybe it had moved. Maybe this was finally a reprieve. Sleep came easier that night, but morning brought unease. On my balcony, leaning over the railing with coffee in hand, I saw it again. Parked in exactly the same spot. The same black paint, the same dull reflection of the street lamp. I blinked hard. Maybe it was someone copying the previous night. Maybe coincidence. But a slow, creeping dread settled in my chest. I began to notice little things I hadn't before. The way shadows pulled unnaturally under its tires. The faint glint of something hanging from the rearview mirror, like an eye, catching and reflecting light. Pedestrians walked past it without a glance, as though it didn't exist. And I, watching, felt myself unravel a little more each day, caught in a loop of observation and fear. I don't know, I stopped trying to rationalize. Each night, the car appeared. Each night, I waited, watched, and prayed it wouldn't be there tomorrow. I told friends, my coworkers, but words fell flat. I began to dread looking out the window, yet I couldn't stop. Something inside me demanded it. Something cold whispered that if I didn't look, I might miss the moment when the car did something unimaginable. And then, one night, it did. The following week felt like a waking nightmare. The car was there every night, in the same spot, a silent black sentinel on the asphalt, waiting. I tried to avoid noticing it, to pretend it wasn't part of my world, but each evening it seemed to assert its presence more insistently. I went for long walks, drank coffee in cafes with bright lights, even stayed later at work, convincing myself that avoidance could break the spell. But each night, as soon as I returned home, there it was. The city around it moved normally, taxi horns, footsteps on wet pavement, the occasional shouted conversation, but the stretch of street the car occupied felt unreal, suspended, as if it existed in its own dimension. I began timing it, watching from my window, noting its position, its slight tilts, the way reflections in the street lamps seemed to bend toward it. One night, I swore I saw the outline of a figure inside, head cocked at a strange angle, hands folded unnaturally on its lap. I blinked and it was gone, yet the impression lingered in my mind, pressing on my chest like a weight. I called the police, voice shaking. "There's a car," I said, "parked outside my apartment. It's just there every night." The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Can you describe it?" I gave the license plate, make, model, color. She suggested taking photographs, writing down times, reporting suspicious behavior. I thanked her, but the reassurances felt hollow. The car did not follow ordinary rules. It existed beyond simple reporting. That night, curiosity and fear combined, and I couldn't resist. I watched from the window until my eyes ached. The street was empty, quiet, every ambient sound swallowed by the car's presence. Then the headlights flickered. A faint, stuttering glow, too dim to light the pavement properly, but enough to cast long, unnatural shadows. I froze. A movement inside, a lean forward, a tilt of the head, something wrong about the angle of the limbs, too sharp, too deliberate. My chest tightened. The smell was stronger now, metallic, bitter, almost like rust and burnt rubber, but with something else underneath, something organic and wrong. It drifted upward, curling along the building, curling around my ankles when I stepped near the window. I gagged, heart hammering. The world outside carried on as if nothing existed, passing pedestrians, distant sirens, but in my small patch of reality, the car commanded everything. I felt invisible, pinned by its gaze. Sleep became impossible. I sat at the kitchen table, lights off, curtains open just enough to see. Hours passed, or minutes, time felt distorted. Every small noise outside made me jump, a car door slamming 2 blocks away, footsteps echoing on the pavement. And yet, nothing moved inside the black car, not in the way that made sense. I saw shapes shifting, shadows sliding along the interior, but no human forms, no living creature that my mind could recognize. I began to document obsessively. Photographs failed. The camera refused to focus on the car. The images always came out hazy, distorted, as if the lens itself rejected its presence. I tried audio recordings, listening for engine hums, movement inside, whispers. At first, there was silence. Then, sometimes, faint noises, a soft metallic scrape, a hiss like someone exhaling through teeth, a whisper that seemed to loop the same syllables over and over, almost rhythmic, almost calling my name. I would jump, drop the recorder, and reassure myself, it's imagination, stress, too many sleepless nights. I started seeing the door open slightly by itself, slow, deliberate, almost like breathing. Nothing emerged, yet the space seemed to stretch outward, darker than the night around it. I imagined figures leaning forward, faces obscured by shadows, observing me with intent. Each time, my rational mind attempted an explanation, a trick of light, reflections from passing cars, uneven condensation, but instinct screamed otherwise. Something about the car was wrong, profoundly wrong, alive in a way that defied reason. One night, desperation overtook me. I needed to see, to confront. I left my apartment, hands shaking, and stepped onto the street. Cold air bit at my skin. The street was empty, the usual hum of distant traffic muted. And there it waited, black, still, ominous. I circled it once, hesitant, examining every detail. Tires worn. Dirt on the license plate. Inside, faint reflections moved. Breath on the windows. And then the smell, iron, burnt rubber, decay. It filled my lungs, turned my stomach, and pressed against the back of my skull with impossible weight. I pressed my hand against the hood. Cold. Dead. Lifeless, or so it seemed. And yet, instinct screamed that it was aware of me. That awareness, it was a presence, a sentience that crawled into the marrow of my bones. I stepped back, but my curiosity tethered me. A shape shifted inside. Limbs bent unnaturally. The head tilted. Eyes, or something like eyes, caught the faint lamplight, glinting, observing. I stumbled back, tripping over the curb, and scrambled to the steps of my building. My hands shook uncontrollably. My heart pounded. I bolted inside, slammed the door, locked it, pressed my back against it. Sweat poured down my face. The engine roared, low at first, then rising to a scream, as if the car itself had noticed my fear. Tires screeched against asphalt. I could hear it moving around the block. Closer? Impossible to tell. Then silence. The faint scent lingered. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, unable to breathe properly, staring at the door as if it might open on its own. I never saw the car again. Not after that night. The street returned to normal. Traffic, pedestrians, ordinary life. But I know it's still there. Waiting. Always waiting. Even now, when the street is quiet and shadows fall in the corner of my vision, I feel it. I feel the weight of awareness, the pressure of something that observes, calculates, and waits. I survived, but in surviving, I am forever marked. The street is ordinary again, but my nights are not. My sleep is haunted. My quiet moments are invaded. And I know, deep down, if I looked, I would see it again, as I always have. Days after that night, when the roar of the engine had ceased and the street returned to its usual hum, I convinced myself that it was over. Perhaps I had imagined the car's intelligence, the shifting shadows, the breath on the windows. Perhaps exhaustion had warped reality. But deep down, I knew the feeling of being watched, the weight in my chest, would never leave. I tried to resume a semblance of normal life, making coffee at the same time, going to work, returning home, but every step toward the window was accompanied by the whisper of dread. I resolved, finally, that if it returned, I would confront it fully. I needed proof, some way to expose it or banish it from my life. I purchased a small handheld camera with infrared capability, convinced that if there was something alive inside, night vision might reveal it. The camera arrived midweek. I left it charged on the balcony, lens trained on the street below, and forced myself to sleep early, telling myself I would face the morning with reason, with evidence, with courage. At 2:17 a.m., I woke to a faint metallic scrape outside my window. My heart froze. I thought, maybe it's gone for good. Maybe I misremembered the past weeks. But then came the smell, that same bitter, metallic stench curling upward from the asphalt, seeping into my apartment. It was unmistakable. I flung open the balcony door, camera in hand, and there it was. Black, waiting, silent, larger somehow than it had ever seemed. The streetlights glinted faintly off its hood, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally across the sidewalk. I raised the camera, recording, hands shaking violently. The car's driver's side door creaked open slowly, deliberately, though no one emerged. A figure shifted inside, thin, impossibly still, faceless. The interior seemed to shimmer like liquid darkness, like shadows pooling and breathing. I swallowed my panic, voice barely audible. What are you? No reply came, only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I took a cautious step closer, balcony railing pressing against my chest, heart hammering so hard it felt audible over the street. Then, the impossible happened. The figure stepped out, not fully, not in a human sense, but in a motion that defied geometry, limbs bending in impossible angles, head tilting sharply to one side as if examining me. The tires groaned against the asphalt, though they moved with a fluidity that suggested the car itself was alive, a creature that unfolded from metal and shadow. I stumbled backward, camera dropping to the floor with a loud clatter, lens pointing upward. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave, but my legs refused to obey. My body was frozen, riveted by the sight of something that should not exist in the ordered world of Cedar Street. The air thickened, scent of iron and decay pressing into my lungs. I gagged, fell to my knees, tried to scream, but my voice caught. And then I noticed it, subtle at first, almost comical in its absurdity, reflections of my own movements in the car's surfaces, not quite right. My arms were longer in the glass, my face distorted, shadows where none should be. I realized, with cold terror, that it wasn't just observing me. It was merging with me, mapping me, absorbing me into its geometry of horror. I thought, fleetingly, that the only way to survive was to act. I lunged for the door, barely keeping my balance, stumbled into the apartment, slammed the door behind me. The sound of the engine revving followed immediately, low and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards and into my teeth. I barricaded myself with every piece of furniture I could shove against the door. The smell was everywhere now, filling every corner of the apartment, suffocating in its persistence. My pulse thundered, panic and adrenaline collided. Hours passed. Or perhaps minutes. Time lost meaning. Every small noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of pipes, was amplified into a potential threat. Then, silence. An impossible, suffocating silence. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe audibly. And when I finally summoned courage to peek through the blinds, the street was empty. Ordinary streetlights, ordinary asphalt. No black car, no shadows, no smell. My relief was so intense it nearly sent me into tears. I didn't sleep properly for days. I called friends, family, anyone who would listen, but no one believed me. I realized, slowly, that proof was impossible. The camera footage was blank, black static where the car had been, lens refusing to capture the unnatural. Even the memory of the figure, as vivid as it was in my mind, felt impossible to describe without being dismissed as hysteria. And yet, I knew what I had seen, and I knew what it had done. Its presence lingered in the marrow of my bones. Weeks later, life resumed a semblance of normalcy. The car never returned. Perhaps it had moved on, or perhaps it had deemed me observed sufficiently. The street was busy again, pedestrians bustling, taxis honking. My apartment felt safe during the day, sunlight reassuring in its ordinariness. And yet, every night, I feel its eyes, or the idea of them watching, pressing against the window, waiting for me to look. I have learned to live with it, to sleep with one eye half open, curtains only partially drawn. I survived. That much is true. The car did not take me, not physically. But I am changed. The sense of being observed never left me. And I know, in the depths of a quiet moment, that if I step onto the balcony again, if I look out just long enough, I might see it. Waiting. Patient. Unyielding. I tell myself I am safe. I tell myself it is gone. And perhaps, in some sense, I am. But deep down, I know the truth. Nothing that lives in the corners of shadow, that moves outside the rules of ordinary life, truly disappears. It waits. Always waits. And if it returns, I cannot guarantee what will remain of me. Story 4, The Passenger. It was the kind of evening that felt ordinary enough to be comforting. The sun had sunk low, leaving a pale orange haze in the sky. Clouds stretched thin and drifting lazily, and the road ahead ran straight and empty for miles, lined with tall trees that rustled softly in the autumn wind. I was driving back from a late client meeting, the air crisp and clean through a slightly cracked window, the hum of the engine steady beneath me. The radio played quietly, some bland pop song I barely noticed, filling the silence without demanding attention. Everything about the night suggested safety, ordinariness, predictability. Then, just past a bend, I noticed a figure standing by the roadside. Tall, lean, their movements uneven as though fatigue had slowed them, yet deliberate. I assumed at first it was someone jogging, a late commuter trying to catch a bus. But the way they lifted a thumb, slow and precise, made me hesitate. Hitchhikers were rare in this part of town, almost unheard of, but I felt a tug of curiosity, perhaps concern. I slowed the car and rolled the window down slightly. Need a ride? I asked cautiously, glancing in the rearview mirror. The figure stepped closer, but shadowing their face. Yes. Thank you, they said calmly. The voice was neutral, almost monotonous, carrying a certainty that made my chest tighten. I hesitated. It didn't feel right, yet I unlocked the rear door and gestured for them to enter. They slipped in silently, without bag or any visible belongings, seating themselves quietly. The car smelled faintly of wet leather and the lingering aroma of my coffee. For several minutes, we drove without speaking. The tires hummed over the asphalt, the city muted around us. Then, abruptly, they said, "You always leave the bathroom light on at night, even though you know it wakes you." My hands tightened on the wheel, pulse spiking. I don't know what you mean, I stammered, laughing nervously, hoping it was a coincidence. But the next words froze me. Your toothbrush is blue. You bought it last month after the other one wore down. You left it on the sink this morning. The color, the timing, it was impossible. I had left it there, what from brushing. I swallowed, trying to laugh it off. Okay, funny guess, I said. They didn't smile, didn't blink. Their eyes, calm and neutral, held mine through the mirror. I forced myself to focus on the road, trying to believe it was coincidence, intuition, or observation, yet an icy weight settled in my stomach. The details kept coming. You stopped speaking to your cousin after the argument last November. You haven't answered her emails. You keep a photograph in your wallet of your old dog, tucked in the back. My pulse jumped, heart hammering against my ribs. This was beyond coincidence. I swallowed dryly, forcing a calm voice. How do you know that? They tilted their heads slightly. I know many things about you. Things you do not even speak aloud. Panic bubbled beneath my control. I laughed, weakly. Are you some kind of prankster? But they remained silent. The seatbelt cut across their chest, their posture rigid, yet there was a subtle, suffocating pressure in the car, as if their presence expanded beyond their form. The air seemed thicker. Then came the next detail. You leave the kitchen light on for exactly 3 minutes after washing dishes. You hum the same tune you learned in school when alone. You have letters hidden in your desk drawer that you haven't opened in years. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. The specificity, the intimacy, it was impossible. No person could know this without prior observation, and even then, these were private habits, hidden moments. I glanced at them in the rearview mirror. Their hooded face remained neutral, yet I felt their gaze penetrate into my thoughts, into the corners I had never dared expose. My rational mind screamed for explanations, social media, coincidences, luck, but the evidence of my memory was irrefutable. I tried to stop at the next exit, imagining a lit gas station or diner where I could confront them. But before I could act, their voice sliced through my thoughts. You will not ask me to leave. Not until I decide. I froze, hands rigid on the wheel. Excuse me? I said, voice firmer than I felt. Their eyes did not shift. I decide when I leave. You cannot force me. You cannot escape me. A chill crawled up my spine. I laughed nervously, trying to mask the terror, but I realized they weren't bluffing. Their knowledge, their calm authority, pressed down on me physically. I glanced at them again. Faint earthy scent of soil and rain clung to them, out of place in the car, in the city, at night. I realized fully I was trapped. Not by locks, not by walls, not by physical constraint, but by awareness. Every hidden habit, every secret, every intimate thought, they knew. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The world outside continued its ordinary rhythm, distant traffic, pedestrians, streetlights flickering, but the car felt alien, a vessel of something patient, deliberate, and entirely beyond comprehension. My pulse raced. My breath shortened. I drove on past familiar intersections that now seemed strange, alien, the city itself bending under the weight of the passenger's presence. They remained still, quiet, unblinking, yet utterly alive in a way that made me feel small, observed, and powerless. And then I realized the truth. I could not force them out. I could not escape. I was at the mercy of this passenger, confined within my own vehicle, my own habits, my own life. They had decided the journey, and until it ended, I would go where they allowed. Every instinct screamed to stop, call for help, abandon the car, but the certainty in their voice, the precise knowledge of my private life, silenced every argument. I was no longer in control. I was merely driving, and they were the passenger. The next night, sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the passenger's eyes, gray, unblinking, unnervingly calm, boring into me, observing every fleeting thought. I told myself it was paranoia, exhaustion from long hours at work, but the thought of getting back into the car the next day made my stomach tighten with dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the precision of their knowledge, the way they described habits, memories, secrets I hadn't spoken aloud in years. Someone or something had mapped my life in a way that no ordinary human could. By evening, I found myself at the wheel again, drawn as if by gravity to the road, searching for any rational explanation, any distraction to convince myself that last night had been a dream. The city was quieter than usual, streetlights casting pools of orange and white on the asphalt. I passed familiar intersections, neon signs blinking lazily, cafes shutting down. And there, just past the bend where I had first picked them up, a shadow waited. Lean, hooded, impossible to ignore. I slowed instinctively. The passenger slid into the car without a word, as if our prior ride had been preordained. The air inside was different now, heavier, suffused with a faint scent of damp earth and something metallic I couldn't place. I tried to keep my voice casual. "Where do you want to go?" I asked, though the answer felt irrelevant. They didn't respond immediately. When they finally spoke, it was in that same calm, precise voice that chilled me. "You've changed your morning routine this week. You skip your usual breakfast and walk straight to work. You've noticed it, but haven't admitted it to anyone." The level of detail was suffocating. I laughed nervously, forcing a semblance of levity, but my chest ached, my fingers tightened on the wheel. "Okay, that's enough," I said. "How do you know these things?" They tilted their heads slightly, and their gaze seemed to stretch beyond the car, into my thoughts, my memories. "I know all the details you think are private. The ones you hide even from yourself. You can't escape me." Panic began to rise, slow and steady, like cold water filling my lungs. I tried to stop at the next gas station, imagining confrontation, calling the police, asking them to leave. But their voice cut through every rational thought. "You cannot force me out. I decide when the journey ends. Not you. Not anyone else." My pulse spiked. Their calm certainty, combined with their knowledge, made resistance feel futile. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps they had observed me online, learned habits through social media, casual conversations, unnoticed glimpses. But the specifics, the letters in my desk, the songs I hummed when alone, the exact time I leave lights on, could not be explained. My rational mind floundered, grasping at anything that could remove the terror. The passenger leaned slightly forward, and I noticed the subtle movements, almost imperceptible, fingers brushing the seat, head tilting, like they were alive in a way beyond flesh, beyond ordinary presence. Hours passed. The world outside, the streetlights, the distant traffic, the occasional pedestrian, continued in normal rhythm, oblivious to what was happening in my car. Yet the interior of the vehicle became a claustrophobic chamber. Every secret, every habit, every thought I tried to hide seemed laid bare, illuminated by an invisible light only they could wield. My knuckles whitened, my jaw ached from clenching. I was exhausted, but unable to stop. To stop would be to surrender, and I was not ready to admit how powerless I felt. Then came the first direct threat. Not spoken, not overt, but implied. The passenger's words flowed softly, almost conversational. "You keep a bottle of sleeping pills in your nightstand. You've never used them. You told yourself it was precaution. I know you better than you know yourself. Do you feel the weight of it? Do you feel how exposed you are?" I swallowed hard, a shiver running down my spine. I felt as though they were inside my skull, tracing thoughts, marking memories, leaving traces of themselves in places they could never physically be. I tried to accelerate, imagining I could shake them, outrun this uncanny presence. But the car responded differently than expected, as though it existed partially outside the laws of ordinary physics. The engine hummed low, heavy, resonant. The steering felt subtly uncooperative, the tires gripping the road in ways that suggested deliberation beyond my control. Every instinct screamed to stop, abandon the road, but fear and fascination intertwined, holding me captive in a strange equilibrium. The ride stretched endlessly. Intersections blurred. Streetlights flickered. Pedestrians were gone. Even the city seemed muted, hushed. And all the while, the passenger spoke with quiet certainty, reciting details I had no right to believe they could know. My childhood home, the broken window I'd never told anyone about, the song I hummed to my dog before it died. The intimacy of their knowledge made me tremble, tears forming unbidden. They did not speak threateningly. Threat was unnecessary. The mere act of knowing was a weapon, and I was utterly exposed. At one point, I glimpsed my reflection in the rearview mirror and noticed the way I had changed. Pallid, eyes wide, hands trembling on the wheel. And for the first time, I understood they had not merely entered my car. They had entered my life, mapped its contours, and ensnared me in a presence that could not be shaken. I realized fully that until they chose, the journey would continue, the car's interior a prison of fear and observation. Resistance was futile. Escape was inconceivable. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, the passenger remained silent, almost casual in their watchfulness. I had driven for hours, though it felt like days. My mind was fractured between terror, exhaustion, and the impossible recognition that I would survive only because they allowed it. And yet, even as the first birds sang, even as the streetlights blinked off and the world returned to ordinary rhythm, I knew deep in my bones that this presence was patient, deliberate, unending. They might not leave tonight or tomorrow. They might follow forever. And I, trapped in the inevitability of their knowledge, gripped the wheel, breath shallow, and realized that nothing would ever be ordinary again. The next night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the apartment, every flicker of the streetlight outside, made my pulse spike. I stared at the clock, then at the door, imagining them stepping in unbidden, silent and knowing. I forced myself to remember the passenger was not here yet. Not physically. But the weight of their presence, what they could do, what they knew was suffocating. I made a decision. If they appeared again, I would not let the night stretch endlessly. I would confront, reason, force an end. Hours later, I drove. I didn't know why, only that standing still felt more dangerous than moving. The streets were empty, shadows long and sharp in the streetlights. I passed familiar bends, my eyes flicking to the shoulder of the road. And there they were, waiting as if they had known exactly where I would be, down to the second. I slowed, swallowing hard, then pulled over. Without a word, they slid into the back seat, silent as a shadow falling over the car. The air shifted immediately. A faint smell of wet earth, metallic and raw, filled the interior. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white. "Why are you here?" I asked, voice steadier than I felt. They tilted their head. "Because it is time," they said, voice soft and calm, yet resonating with authority. "Because we have unfinished matters." My stomach turned. I tried to reason, observation, coincidence, psychological manipulation. But the details came too quickly, too precisely, too intimately. Every hidden habit, every memory I thought forgotten, they recited without hesitation. "I know when you hide letters in your desk drawer," they said, "and why you haven't read them. I know the day your dog died and the song you hummed that morning. I know what you tell yourself when no one is watching, and even what you deny to yourself." My chest tightened. I forced my voice out. You're lying. This is impossible." But their gaze, unblinking and calm, crushed disbelief. I felt my control slip, reality bend around their certainty. Hours passed, though it could have been minutes or days. The city became a blur of dim lights and empty streets. The passenger spoke in measured tones, reciting truth after truth, habit after habit, memory after memory. Every syllable pressed deeper into my mind, a relentless reminder that I was known, observed, mapped in ways I had never imagined. My knuckles burned, my teeth ground, and a shiver ran down my spine that I could not shake. Finally, I realized the truth. The only way to survive was to acknowledge them, to submit in a sense to their observation. Not physically, not as a surrender to violence, but mentally. Resistance, argument, confrontation, none of it mattered. They were patient, deliberate, utterly in control. And in a way that terrified me, I understood that attempting to flee or escape would accomplish nothing. Their presence was not bound by time or space. It was awareness itself, a force that could exist wherever I was, whatever I did. I drove until dawn. By then, fatigue had set into my bones, shaking me with exhaustion and fear. The passenger remained silent, watchful. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the journey was not about distance. It was about time, and my understanding of it, compressed and distorted by their presence. Every secret I had, every action, every thought, had been catalogued. And they had chosen not to act, not to strike, only to exist alongside me, a shadow of inevitable truth. When the first light touched the horizon, the streets became ordinary again. Shops opened. Pedestrians moved. Traffic hummed normally. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The passenger was gone. No trace. No scent, no shadow, no explanation. And yet, the car I had driven felt smaller, emptier, haunted by their absence. I realized that survival was not safety. I had escaped their presence physically, but mentally they remained, folded into my awareness, impossible to dislodge. Weeks passed. I tried to resume life, to convince myself it had been coincidence, imagination, the product of stress. But every moment of silence, every night alone, carried their echo. I would never be alone again. I understood finally, the passenger had not been a person. They had been knowledge made manifest, presence made inevitable, and I had no means to unlearn what they had shown me. I survived. That much is true. I live, I work, I move, and yet the intimacy of their knowledge, the certainty of their awareness, remains. Every time I feel observed, every time a detail too precise lodges in my mind, I know they are still with me. Not as a body, not as a threat in the ordinary sense, but as a force. And I understand, with unshakable clarity, that survival is only the beginning. There is no closure, no final confrontation, no escape. There is only living under the weight of what they know, and what I cannot unsee. Story 5, Shadow Pace. It began like any other evening. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and fallen leaves, the kind that signals the tail end of autumn. I laced up my running shoes, stretching briefly before stepping onto the familiar path that wound through the quiet suburban streets and adjoining park. Streetlights flickered on as dusk fell, painting long, soft shadows across the asphalt. The rhythm of my breathing, the soft thud of sneakers against pavement, was the only soundtrack I needed. I had been jogging this route for years, and the routine comforted me. I knew every bend, every crack in the sidewalk, every overgrown hedge that marked the park's edge. For the first mile, everything felt normal. The distant hum of traffic, occasional barking dogs, the whisper of leaves in the wind, all ordinary background noise, nothing to unsettle a runner in his element. I fell into my pace, counting strides in my head, feeling the familiar burn in my calves and lungs. The day had been long, work tedious, and this run was my ritual escape, the moment when nothing existed except motion and breath. Then I noticed it, almost imperceptibly at first. Footsteps. Not mine, not echoing off the pavement, but behind me. A pattern and rhythm, soft and consistent, matching my own. I slowed briefly, listening, hoping it was nothing, another jogger, perhaps, or someone walking a dog. But the sound did not waver, did not break, did not accelerate or lag. It was synchronized perfectly with my stride. My stomach tightened, but I told myself rationally that it was coincidence, the rhythm of someone else's steps aligning with mine by chance. I veered slightly to the left, into the shadow of a low hedge, and glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the park stretching empty behind me, the trees casting long, loping shadows. I exhaled sharply, chastising myself for letting imagination creep in. I picked up my pace again, trying to ignore the tension coiling in my chest. And yet, the sound returned, persistent and exact. Footsteps. Matching mine. Slightly delayed, a fraction behind, always just out of view. My mind raced. Perhaps a dog? I would have seen it. Perhaps another jogger? But where was the silhouette? Streetlights cast long angles across the pavement. If anyone were behind me, I would have noticed. The park had no other lights, no other paths within sight. I tried running faster, testing the theory, pushing my legs, my lungs screaming. The footsteps accelerated with me, never faltering. Panic began to rise, a slow, simmering fear pressing against rational thought. I darted a glance over my shoulder again. Shadows pulled in the trees, deepening where the streetlight failed to reach, but nothing concrete emerged. Still, I could feel a presence, something there, keeping pace, waiting, almost breathing in rhythm with me. My mind raced for explanations. A lost jogger, someone playing a prank, my own imagination running wild after too many late nights. Yet, every rational thought was undermined by the certainty of it. Somebody or something was there, moving with me, perfectly timed, just beyond my sight. The path curved sharply, leading under a narrow overpass where streetlights couldn't penetrate. I slowed, heart hammering, ears straining in the dim. Footsteps. Just behind me, echoing softly against the concrete walls. I stopped abruptly, gasping, and the sound halted too. Silence pressed down, thick and tangible, as if the air itself had grown heavier. I peered into the shadows. Nothing. A trick of the light, I told myself. Nothing exists in the dark if you do not see it. Then I moved again, cautiously, stepping forward, slow and deliberate. Footsteps resumed. Behind me, matching, never faltering, never speeding, never showing themselves. I clenched my fists, adrenaline surging through my veins. Rationality and fear collided. My body wanted to flee, but my mind demanded clarity. I couldn't see them, couldn't identify what followed me, yet every instinct screamed danger. Panic mingled with disbelief. The jogger's path I had known for years suddenly felt alien, the familiar shadows now sinister, the empty stretches of asphalt no longer comforting. Trees seemed to lean inward, the darkness pooling unnaturally at the corners of my vision. I sprinted, forcing legs to move faster than usual, heart thudding in my throat. The footsteps mirrored me, flawless, inexorable. They did not falter. They did not break. I risked another glance backward. My stomach nodded. In the gloom of a tree line, a shape shifted, elongated and blurred, always just beyond clarity, indistinct but undeniably there. My legs burned, lungs ached, yet terror propelled me forward. Rational thought collapsed under the weight of the undeniable. Someone or something was pacing me, just out of view, patient and impossibly coordinated. I burst from the tree line into the main street, lights of houses spilling across the road. The sound of footsteps slowed, then ceased. Relief struck, sudden and jarring, though my body trembled violently. I risked another glance. Nothing. Just shadows and empty asphalt. Rationality returned in fragments. Perhaps it was a stranger jogging the path, a trick of shadows, an auditory illusion. Yet deep down, a creeping certainty gnawed at me. I returned home that night, showered, shivering, unable to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the window made my heart race. Rational explanations faded under the memory of perfect synchronization, of a shadow just out of reach, of the impossible timing of footsteps matching mine for miles. I knew, with a cold clarity, that the world had shifted in some small, terrifying way. That somewhere, in the dark, something had been with me, patient and waiting. The following evening, I returned to the same path despite the knot of unease in my chest. Rationality whispered that last night had been coincidence, some trick of sound or imagination. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the footsteps were a one-time anomaly. The air was colder now, carrying a sharper scent of damp leaves and wet earth, and the sky had taken on the deep violet of approaching night. Streetlights flickered on as I stepped onto the pavement, lacing my shoes with trembling fingers, listening to the familiar hum of the neighborhood settling into evening quiet. The first mile passed without incident. My breathing fell into rhythm, the burn in my legs comforting in its familiarity. Perhaps it had been imagination, I told myself. Perhaps exhaustion had amplified ordinary sounds into phantom footsteps. But as I rounded the bend into the tree-lined stretch of the park, I heard it again. Soft, deliberate, matched to my pace. Behind me. I stopped abruptly, holding my breath. Footsteps mirrored mine, almost exactly, just out of sight in the gathering shadows. Rationality faltered. I glanced over my shoulder. The park stretched empty. No runner, no walker, no dog, nothing visible, yet the sound persisted. It was too precise. A heartbeat later, I jogged again, testing my own nerves. Footsteps accelerated with me, never breaking, never fading, just outside my perception. I veered toward the gravel path at the park's edge, thinking perhaps the crunch of loose stones would mask or reveal the intruder. The sound persisted, rhythmically accurate, unnervingly patient. My stomach churned as I imagined the possibilities. Someone stalking me, a prank, some deranged game. But why remain unseen? Why follow silently? Each thought collided with the next, rationality and fear warring inside me. The path curved beneath a stand of tall oaks, their long shadows pooling in the dim light. The footsteps were closer now, yet no shape emerged. Panic simmered, slow and relentless, coiling around my chest. I tried accelerating, forcing my legs harder, straining against fear. The steps followed, flawless and exact. My mind scrambled for explanations. Could my mind be playing tricks? Could exhaustion or darkness have fabricated the sound? No! The timing, the persistence, the exact replication of my stride, it defied reason. Then I sensed it. A shift in the air. A presence just behind me, closer than mere sound, pressing at the edges of awareness. The hair on my neck rose, goosebumps spreading down my spine. I risked a glance, my eyes straining through gloom and shadow. There. Something blurred and elongated, an indistinct form just beyond clarity, moving in perfect synchronization with me. I froze, frozen by disbelief and fear, the world narrowing to the pounding of my pulse and the soft echo of steps. I tried to run, forcing myself into full sprint, lungs screaming, legs pumping as adrenaline flooded my body. Footsteps kept pace. Faster, harder, yet never catching up, never faltering. They did not belong to flesh, not to ordinary motion. Rational thought dissolved completely. The world became a blur of shadows, trees bending inward, the path narrowing into impossibility. Every instinct screamed danger, my mind cycled through options. Escape? Impossible. Confrontation? Unthinkable. Fight? Absurd. I was trapped in the rhythm, a prisoner of motion. My chest heaved as I turned sharply, cutting through a side path toward the park exit. Footsteps followed exactly, mirroring every movement. Panic became terror. My mind searched for logic. Perhaps another runner had always been there, invisible until now. Perhaps the sound was echo, coincidence, auditory trickery. Yet a cold certainty clawed at me. This was no accident, no natural phenomenon. Something was deliberately tracking me, just beyond sight, patient and relentless. Finally, I reached the streetlights of the suburban avenue, relief mingled with lingering dread. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. I risked another glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the dim, empty path. My body shook violently, lungs heaving, sweat stinging my eyes. Rational thought returned in fragments. Perhaps they had retreated, gone, or had never existed in a visible sense. Perhaps the world was ordinary again. Yet as I walked home, I could not shake the certainty. Someone or something had matched my pace for miles, silent, invisible, waiting. Rationality provided no comfort. Logic faltered. My ordinary route had become alien. Shadows seemed to linger longer, air itself felt charged. I realized, with a growing sense of unease, that the night held a predator unlike any I could reason away. One that was patient, precise, and impossibly close, even when unseen. I returned home trembling, heart still hammering, showered, and tried to sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind, every faint thud outside my window made me flinch. Rationality whispered excuses, but deep down, I knew the truth. The presence that had paced me was real. I had seen it, or felt it, and it was patient. It was deliberate. It was waiting. And next time, I would not simply outrun it. The next evening, I forced myself back onto the path, though every nerve screamed at me to stay home. Rational thought had nothing left to offer. The footsteps had been real, persistent, impossibly precise. The park stretched before me in fading light, ordinary yet now charged with menace. My chest tightened with each step, lungs burning, legs trembling, as if my body anticipated the unseen presence waiting somewhere in the shadows. I could almost feel it, patient and deliberate, just beyond perception, matching every stride. The first mile passed in silence. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, some trick of light and sound amplified by fear. But as I approached the curve beneath the stand of tall oaks, the rhythm returned. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, synchronous with my own. They had waited, hidden, to resume their watch. I froze, clutching the straps of my jacket, heart hammering in my throat. The sound persisted, exact, steady, as if my own legs were mirrored by another. Rationality failed. There was no coincidence this time. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Shadows pulled among the trees, shifting, elongating unnaturally in the dim streetlights. A chill crawled up my spine. I tried accelerating, sprinting with desperate force, hoping to outrun the impossible. The footsteps mirrored me perfectly, neither lagging nor advancing. My legs burned, lungs screamed, but I could not shake the presence. Every instinct shouted danger. My mind raced, forming frantic plans to turn, confront, escape, but I knew, deep down, none would work. Then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, stretched long and impossible, movement smooth and deliberate. Not human exactly, yet the shape was vaguely familiar, humanoid in contour. The shadow did not hurry, did not speak, did not make a sound beyond the echo of those synchronized steps. And yet I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was aware of me, that it had been aware all along. It had matched my pace not out of chance, but purpose. Fear turned to primal terror. I spun, intending to run straight home, to abandon the path entirely. But the shadow shifted instantly, matching the turn, sliding seamlessly between trees, remaining just beyond full visibility. My rational mind faltered completely. There was no ordinary explanation. The world around me had warped. The familiar park became alien, a trap of shadows and sound. Each step I took was tracked, mirrored, anticipated. I realized I was not merely observed, I was hunted. I forced my legs faster, sprinting, adrenaline and panic driving me. Footsteps followed, precise, flawless, as if the shadow existed to ensure I never truly escaped. My lungs burned, my vision blurred with sweat and fear. The park narrowed, trees leaning inward, darkness folding like a living thing around me. I risked another glance behind. The shadow remained, impossibly close yet untouchable, its presence both definite and unreal. My body shook violently, every instinct screamed flight, yet my mind struggled to comprehend what followed me. Then I understood. The shadow was not just pacing me. It was measuring, cataloging, marking each movement, each breath, each reaction. It existed as an extension of my own motion, inseparable and inevitable. Panic collided with realization. Resistance was useless. Escape in the conventional sense was impossible. The only choice was to endure, to survive long enough for some unknown conclusion, whatever it might be. The path opened onto the main street, illuminated by suburban lights. I burst out, chest heaving, legs trembling uncontrollably. The footsteps slowed, then stopped entirely. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing moved in the shadows. The street was empty. The presence was gone, or perhaps it had chosen to remain hidden, lingering just beyond perception, patient as ever. Relief struck, but it was shallow, ephemeral. I had survived, but the knowledge remained. Weeks passed. I avoided the park, altered routines, retraced routes to ensure no shadow followed. Rationality whispered excuses, coincidence, auditory illusion, imagination. But the certainty never left me. I felt it at night, in quiet streets, in reflective surfaces, in the corners of rooms where shadows pulled unnaturally. It had not been a person, not a prankster, not an accident. It had been a force, patient, deliberate, impossible to evade. I survived. That is true. But survival is not freedom. Every step I take, every breath I draw, carries the echo of those synchronized footsteps, the presence of the shadow that knows me, measures me, waits for me. I can run, I can hide, I can ignore, but it exists outside the bounds of ordinary perception, inevitable and unshakable. And I know, with absolute clarity, that I will never be alone again. Story 6, The Silent Watchers. We had been driving for hours, leaving the city behind, windows down to catch the last hints of summer air, winding through narrow country roads lined with trees that glowed golden amber in the late afternoon sun. The weekend getaway was meant to be simple: a tent, a campfire, the occasional walk through the nearby trails. My partner, Clara, hummed softly in the passenger seat, scrolling through a playlist on her phone, occasionally glancing at me with a smile that warmed the nerves that had begun to fray after a long week at work. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that promises calm, a pause from the world. We arrived just before sunset. The campground was nearly empty, a scattering of tents and RVs, most clustered near the river. Our assigned site was secluded, bordered by thick undergrowth and a line of birch trees that caught the last rays of light. I carried the cooler, Clara hauled our tent and bags. We worked in a comfortable rhythm, pitching the tent, arranging sleeping bags, the familiar tasks soothing in their repetition. By the time we finished, shadows had lengthened across the ground, the air cool and still. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft orange glow that seemed to linger longer than natural. The first night passed without incident. We cooked over a small fire, roasted marshmallows, drank from our thermos of wine, and eventually fell asleep to the faint hum of crickets and the whisper of leaves. Nothing disturbed us, nothing seemed amiss. I woke briefly to the sound of wind rustling through the trees, a normal, comforting sound, and fell back into sleep. Clara's presence beside me, even breathing quietly in the darkness, was enough to anchor me in calm. The next morning, we woke to birdsong and the soft rustle of squirrels moving through the underbrush. I noticed, however, a small peculiarity. Our campsite seemed unusually tidy. The fire pit had been swept clean of ash, sticks neatly arranged. Our chairs were perfectly aligned, facing the same direction, as if someone had spent hours positioning them. I frowned, glancing at Clara. "Did you do this?" I asked, half joking. She shook her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "No, I don't touch things until after breakfast." "Did you?" We spent the morning hiking a nearby trail. The forest was quiet, the smell of moss and damp wood clinging to our clothes. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. Yet when we returned, the oddities had multiplied. Our cooler, which I was certain I had zipped and placed near the tent, was now closer to the tree-line. Bags were shifted, arranged neatly as if someone had inspected them, considered them, and returned them to precise positions. My stomach tightened. "Clara," I said, voice low, "I don't like this." She followed my gaze, frowning, scanning the campsite. "It's unsettling," she admitted. We spent the afternoon unpacking, walking a short distance to the river to skip stones and watch the sun glitter off the water. When we returned, we found that the campsite had changed again. Items were moved, small things, almost imperceptibly. Our mugs lined up neatly on a log, a tent flap folded differently, our backpacks positioned at angles we hadn't left them. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the sun. "We're being watched," I said quietly, though the words made my skin prickle with fear. Clara laughed nervously, but the tension in her smile mirrored my own. Maybe it's just maintenance," she suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. As dusk fell, I sat by the fire, attempting to regain composure. The flames cast long, dancing shadows that seemed too deliberate, too carefully placed. Clara tried to brush it off, collecting firewood along the tree line. I felt eyes on us, the sensation pressing against the back of my neck, cold and insistent. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle of leaves, made me flinch. Rational explanations floundered. No other campers had been near, the campground was quiet, the management distant, and there was no one with keys or authority wandering the trails. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Someone had been here, observing us, and rearranging our things. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept a flashlight and a knife within reach, circling the tent every half hour, ears straining for sound. Every creak, every murmur of wind through leaves, made me freeze. Clara whispered from her sleeping bag, voice tight, "I can't sleep either. Something isn't right." I nodded, gripping the flashlight harder, staring into the darkness of the trees that now felt like walls closing in. The campsite, ordinary and welcoming yesterday, had become a cage of uncertainty. Hours later, as the first light of morning touched the treetops, I saw it, or rather, I saw the aftermath. Our bags were now perfectly stacked, the tent flap secured exactly, our chairs aligned with geometric precision. Every item was meticulously arranged, as though someone had studied us, understood our habits, and left a silent message. They had been here, and they could return at will. I realized, fully and chillingly, that this was not about theft or mischief. This was about observation, control, and the undeniable fact that we were no longer alone in the woods. The second day of our trip was suffused with unease. Clara tried to keep spirits up, suggesting a longer hike to the ridge overlooking the valley, but even she couldn't shake the tension that had settled over our campsite. I kept scanning the tree line as we walked, noticing the subtle way shadows pulled where they shouldn't, how branches bent slightly as if brushing against someone unseen. Rational explanations faltered. No other campers were nearby. The forest was quiet, yet I couldn't dismiss the certainty that we were being observed. Returning from the hike, we found the campsite changed again. The firewood was stacked in neat rows, split logs aligned with precision, chairs positioned at exact right angles facing the tent. Our backpacks had been opened slightly, zippers undone just enough to reveal a glimpse of clothing inside, then carefully closed again. Clara's eyes widened as she pointed to the cooler. "It's moved again," she whispered. I ran my hand over the top. It had been shifted several feet toward the tree line. My stomach tightened with fear. Someone had been here while we were away, studying, moving, arranging everything with an obsessive attention to detail. I searched the perimeter, circling the campsite slowly, flashlight in hand even in the daylight. Branches rustled with the wind, leaves fell, but there was no sign of footprints or broken twigs beyond what our presence had caused. It was as if whoever had been here had moved without disturbing a single thing, leaving the campsite perfectly rearranged and yet entirely silent. I shivered. "They're here," I said, voice low. Clara swallowed audibly, gripping my arm. "We need to leave," she said, but I shook my head. The road back was several hours away, and the thought of packing while knowing someone was watching us made me nauseous. That evening, we tried to maintain normalcy. We cooked over the fire, roasted marshmallows, and forced small talk. But every snap of a twig, every distant rustle, made our heads turn sharply. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, folding into shapes that mimic human movement for a heartbeat before vanishing. The forest was silent except for our own presence and the occasional distant bird, yet the sensation of being observed pressed down, heavy and unrelenting. I checked the tree line repeatedly, scanning the darkening underbrush, every instinct screaming that eyes were on us. When night fell fully, we lit lanterns, forming a small, illuminated circle around our tent and fire. Clara suggested we stay close together, and I nodded, gripping a flashlight and the small hatchet I had packed. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made my pulse spike. The campsite, so ordinary just a day before, had transformed into a stage for something deliberate and patient. Rational thought offered no comfort. No one else was in the campground, yet the evidence of intrusion was undeniable. Hours passed slowly. We alternated between restless attempts at sleep and scanning the surroundings, flashlight beams slicing through darkness, casting shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth, subtly stronger than before, as if someone or something had moved through the campsite recently. I tried to convince myself it was wildlife, a raccoon or deer, but the precision of the rearrangements, the deliberate placement of objects, and the absence of typical animal traces made that impossible. At around midnight, I woke to a sound that froze my blood, the faint scraping of a chair across the ground. I bolted upright, shining my flashlight toward the noise. The chair, which had been aligned perfectly next to the fire pit when we went to sleep, was now facing the tent, slightly turned as if someone had used it to observe us. Clara stood beside me, wide-eyed and trembling. I whispered, "They're here," and she nodded silently, clutching my arm. The air was thick with tension, oppressive and heavy, as if the forest itself held its breath. We sat in the lantern glow, eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then another subtle sound, the brush of fabric against leaves, just beyond the firelight, too precise to be wind. A shiver ran down my spine. We were not alone. We had been watched, observed, and the intruder had returned while we slept. The realization was terrifying. We were vulnerable, exposed, and at the mercy of someone who knew our routines, who could manipulate our environment without leaving a trace. Sleep became impossible. The night was a blur of whispered speculation, strained breath, and every sense hyper-alert to movement, sound, and shadow. By dawn, the campsite was rearranged again, everything meticulously in place, as though our brief period of alertness had been noted and accounted for. My stomach knotted with dread. I understood, fully and chillingly, that the observation was ongoing, methodical, and deliberate. Someone had been here, and they would return. The forest had become a cage, and we were its unwitting inhabitants. By the third night, neither of us had slept properly. Clara's nerves were frayed, my own tension was taut like a bowstring ready to snap. We had debated leaving earlier, but the main road was several miles away, and the thought of packing quietly while knowing we were watched filled me with a dread I could not ignore. Still, the evidence of intrusion was undeniable. Our campsite, perfectly rearranged, each item meticulously positioned, betraying a presence we could not see yet could feel in every subtle shift of air, every brush of leaves. We decided to stay together near the fire pit, lanterns lit, hands intertwined. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the trees, drew our attention. Rational thought faltered. Nothing explained the precision of the intrusions, the deliberate timing of rearrangements, the impossibility of the intruder leaving no tracks. My imagination wrestled with the tangible evidence, trying to construct ordinary explanations, but each attempt was obliterated by the subtle perfection of the disturbances. Around midnight, the first true confrontation occurred. A faint rustling came from just beyond the tree line, and the faint scent of damp earth intensified, as if someone or something had approached recently. I gripped the flashlight and hatchet, standing rigid, scanning the darkness. The rustling stopped immediately, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on us. I whispered Clara's name. No response, only the distant sound of leaves shifting in a pattern too deliberate for wind. My pulse throbbed painfully. Then I saw it. At first, a flicker of movement at the very edge of the tree line, easily dismissed as shadow. But the second glance revealed a figure crouched, almost melting into the darkness. Its movements were deliberate, measured. Every slight motion corresponded to the shifts and rearrangements we had seen during the day. My stomach lurched. Whoever or whatever it was, it had been here while we slept, observing, cataloging, controlling our environment. Clara gasped beside me, her hand tightening on mine. The figure remained still, watching, patient. I wanted to shout, to demand explanation, to flee, but fear froze my words. Rationality provided no guidance, there was no precedent for this. The forest around us, familiar in calming days before, had transformed into a stage for deliberate observation and calculated control. My mind cycled through every possible explanation: trespasser, camper with obsession, something inhuman, but each failed against the evidence of precision, patience, and invisibility. I took a cautious step forward. The figure shifted slightly, maintaining distance but following our movements with uncanny timing. The air seemed to tighten around us, thick with anticipation. It was no longer a prank, no longer mere curiosity. It was a predator of routine, an entity capable of calculating our every habit, our every response. I realized with cold certainty that we could not confront it physically. Any attempt would provoke it, and it would not need to act violently. The mere act of presence was dominance. Hours stretched. We remained huddled, watching, waiting, the forest holding its breath. Then the figure retreated into the deeper shadows, moving with effortless grace, vanishing almost entirely. I exhaled slowly, muscles trembling, but the tension remained. By dawn, the campsite had been rearranged once more, the subtle perfection of each placement reaffirming the inescapable truth. The watcher was patient, methodical, and unbound by ordinary constraints. We left immediately. I packed the tent and gear with trembling hands while Clara kept watch. Every shadow, every shifting leaf, made my heart leap. The main road seemed impossibly far, the miles stretching as if the forest itself resisted our escape. Only when we reached the pavement, the familiar rumble of asphalt beneath tires, did I feel some semblance of relief. But the presence remained in memory, in sensation, in the unmistakable impression that we had been studied and catalogued. Weeks later, back in the city, I still feel it. Even among friends, in the safety of our apartment, I sense the meticulous attention, the patient observation. Clara feels it too, though she tries to dismiss it. The campsite is gone, the forest reclaimed by natural sounds, yet the memory is indelible. We were watched, our routines noted, our environment manipulated by a presence beyond comprehension. We survived. That is true. But the certainty remains, the watcher exists beyond sight, beyond reach, and the knowledge of its observation cannot be erased. Survival did not mean freedom. It meant the understanding that we were never alone, that every ordinary setting could be scrutinized, every personal habit catalogued, every moment manipulated. I will never camp in silence again. I will never assume the forest or the world is empty. Because now I know, with unshakable certainty, that some presences do not need to reveal themselves to dominate, and some watchers never leave. Story 7: The Unlatched Door. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun began its descent behind the dense pine forest, the air thick with the scent of damp needles and earth. The place had been recommended online as a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect from city noise and deadlines. The drive out had been long but peaceful, winding through narrow country roads where the horizon was interrupted only by trees and the occasional glimmer of a lake. I felt the familiar relief of solitude, the kind that settles in your chest and loosens tension in your shoulders. The cabin itself was unremarkable from the outside, a modest structure of weathered wood, a stone chimney, a front porch that creaked softly when stepped upon. I unlocked the door and was greeted by the familiar smell of aged pine and dust. The air inside was cool, carrying a faint trace of smoke from the fireplace that had clearly seen little use. I set my bags down and wandered through the small space, noting the simple furnishings: a wooden table, a few chairs, a single bed with crisp linens, and shelves lined with books. Everything was orderly, almost sterile, yet comfortable. I spent the evening unpacking and making a small fire in the fireplace. The light flickered across the walls, casting shadows that danced in sync with the flames. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant caw of a crow. I reminded myself that this was exactly why I had chosen the cabin, to be alone with nothing but natural sounds and my own thoughts. Dinner was simple: canned soup and a loaf of bread. I ate slowly, listening to the crackle of firewood, feeling a sense of calm that had been absent for weeks. Before going to bed, I made sure the door was locked. The key turned with a satisfying click, and I double-checked it, resting my hand on the cold metal for reassurance. The lock held firm, the bolt in place. I felt secure, the kind of simple security you expect in a rural cabin. That night, I slept well, the quiet enveloping me, though occasionally a gust of wind rattled the windows, prompting brief awakenings that I easily dismissed. Morning came with pale light filtering through the blinds. I stretched and rose, moving toward the door with a sense of routine. The moment I reached for the handle, unease hit me. The door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I had locked it last night. I remembered the solid resistance of the bolt, the click of the key turning. Yet here it was, the latch undone, the door hanging open as if someone had simply walked in. Panic fluttered in my chest, but I rationalized maybe I had been careless in the dark, perhaps the old lock was faulty. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the surrounding forest. Nothing moved. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone approaching the cabin. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps a gust of wind had nudged the door open. Yet the bolt required turning. No mere wind could undo it. I forced myself to breathe, inspecting the lock carefully. Everything appeared intact, functioning. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing. The day passed with me trying to enjoy the isolation. I walked a nearby trail, gathered kindling, and returned to tidy the interior. Each time I approached the door, unease flared, yet no further intrusion occurred. I forced normalcy, preparing dinner, reading a book by the fire, convincing myself that the unlocked door had been an accident, an anomaly in the routine of the cabin. Nightfall returned, and with it, the ritual of securing the door. Again, I locked it, turning the key with care, double-checking the bolt, listening for the satisfying click that promised solitude and safety. Yet sleep was uneasy. Every shadow cast by the moonlight through the blinds seemed larger than normal, stretching along the floor, the walls, the ceiling. I woke at intervals, hearing the occasional creak of the cabin settling, dismissing it, forcing myself back to rest. Morning arrived slowly, light creeping across the room, bringing a clarity that felt false when compared to the unease lingering in my chest. I approached the door, and my breath caught sharply. The latch was undone. I recoiled, stomach twisting with dread. This time, there was no rational explanation. I had locked it meticulously the night before. The memory of turning the key, hearing the bolt click, was vivid. And yet, there it was, the door unlatched, slightly ajar, inviting or mocking me. My hand shook as I closed it and locked it again, but the fear had already planted itself, growing, gnawing at the edges of reason. Something was not right. I could not see it, could not hear it, yet the evidence was irrefutable. Someone or something had been inside, and I had been unaware. I tried to dismiss the previous morning as a fluke, a lapse in memory or a fault in the old lock. Yet by midday, a gnawing unease had settled in my chest. Every sound of the wind brushing against the cabin siding, the distant rustle of animals in the underbrush, even the soft pop of logs in the fireplace seemed amplified, loaded with unseen menace. Rational thought struggled to maintain a foothold, but the memory of the door, unlocked and slightly open despite my precautions, refused to be ignored. I spent the afternoon outside, chopping firewood and scanning the surrounding forest. Each tree seemed more menacing than the last, the shadows lengthening unnaturally as the sun dipped toward the horizon. I imagined figures slipping between trunks, glimpses of movement where nothing should exist. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed subtle differences that made my pulse spike. A chair slightly shifted, a blanket draped differently across the bed. I paused, heart hammering, convinced I had left everything in place. Evening came, and I resolved to stay vigilant. I moved methodically, lighting the fireplace, placing a chair near the door so I could see it clearly from across the room. Every sound made me tense, the gentle thump of wood, the soft hum of insects outside, but nothing appeared. Rational explanations began to fray under the mounting tension. The cabin was isolated, the roads miles away, and no one had been visible nearby. And yet, the signs were undeniable. Night fell fully. I double-checked the lock, listened for the satisfying click, and even wedged a chair against the door. Hours passed with restless, shallow sleep, punctuated by sudden awakenings at creaks, groans, and the occasional scraping sound I could not explain. I forced myself to believe it was the cabin settling, or animals brushing against the exterior. But the nagging certainty grew with every passing hour. Someone had been inside. Around midnight, a noise jolted me awake. A soft scraping along the wooden floor, deliberate and careful. I froze, straining my ears. The fireplace embers cast flickering shadows across the room, and in that light, I saw it, the door handle turning slowly, deliberately, as if guided by unseen fingers. My heart leapt, adrenaline flooding my veins. I grabbed a hatchet from beside the bed, hands trembling, every muscle coiled for flight or defense. The handle stopped moving. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, listening to the uneven rhythm of my own pulse, the faint tick of the cabin clock. Rationality had no place here. There was no human explanation that fit the evidence. Whoever or whatever had been opening the door knew my routine, my precautions, and had circumvented them with terrifying ease. I realized that the isolation I had sought for peace had become a trap, the walls closing in, the door no longer a barrier but a point of vulnerability. Hours passed. The night dragged with agonizing slowness. Every creak, every whisper of wind seemed magnified, hinting at movement just beyond sight. I stayed alert, the hatchet in hand, lantern casting long, erratic shadows that flickered across the walls. Sleep was impossible. The cabin, so inviting a day before, now felt like a stage for observation, a place where the normal rules no longer applied. By morning, I was exhausted, hair damp with sweat, eyes raw. I approached the door cautiously, praying for rational explanation. The latch was undone. Slightly, impossibly. My stomach twisted. This time, there was no room for doubt. Someone had been inside while I slept, unobserved, patient, precise. Panic clawed at my chest, a relentless, icy force. I packed my things quickly, determined to leave the cabin and never return. The sense of being watched lingered, a suffocating presence that seemed to press against the walls and windows, following me even as I loaded my car. As I drove away, the forest receded behind me, but the cabin's image remained etched in my mind. I knew, with terrifying clarity, that the presence had been patient, deliberate, and aware of my every movement. Survival, in this case, had been a matter of leaving before it revealed itself fully. Yet the memory, the certainty of intrusion, lingered like a shadow, impossible to escape, a warning that solitude can sometimes invite dangers far beyond reason. That night, I made a decision. I could not stay in the cabin any longer, but neither could I simply drive away without facing what had been happening. The unease had taken root in my chest, a constant, heavy weight, and I knew ignoring it would only make things worse. I packed a small bag with essentials, flashlight, hatchet, phone, water, and a few clothes. Every sound outside, every creak of the old cabin settling, made my nerves taut. Sleep was impossible, and I didn't want it. I wanted to be alert, ready, aware. I secured the door as best I could, wedging a chair beneath the handle, then double-checked the lock. The latch clicked convincingly, and yet I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing against me. Shadows pulled in the corners, flickering in the dim lantern light. I moved methodically, flashlight in hand, scanning every angle. Rational thought told me I was alone, that there was no one here. Yet every instinct screamed that I was wrong, that someone or something was observing, testing me. Hours passed slowly, each minute stretched thin by tension. Then I heard it, the soft, deliberate scrape of wood against the floor. My blood froze. I shone the flashlight toward the door. The handle turned slowly, impossibly, as if invisible fingers were easing it open. My heart raced uncontrollably. I raised the hatchet, muscles trembling, waiting. The door swung wide. Silence. No shape appeared, no shadow lingered, and yet I felt eyes on me, patient, deliberate. I realized, fully and terrifyingly, that the presence did not need to reveal itself to assert control. I knew I could not stay. I grabbed my bag and rushed through the cabin, flashlight bouncing across walls and furniture. Every step felt like a test, every movement monitored. Outside, the forest was dark, but I ran, leaving the porch, leaping over roots and low branches. The air was cold, damp, heavy, pressing against me as if the night itself were aware of my flight. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear propelled me forward, away from the cabin, away from the unknown that had invaded my refuge. The road was a distant line of black in the forest, and I ran toward it blindly. My car was parked at the edge of the clearing, headlights off, keys in the ignition. I reached it, fumbling in panic, and started the engine. The cabin loomed behind me, dark and silent, yet the certainty of being watched remained. I drove without pause, tires crunching on gravel, eyes scanning the tree line, every shadow threatening, every rustle hinting at pursuit. The forest gave way to open fields, then the road back to civilization. The weight of dread lifted slightly, though it never fully left. Weeks later, I have returned to normal routines, but the memory of the cabin remains vivid. I replay the sound of the latch turning, the way shadows shifted, the meticulous rearrangement of the interior. No one else saw what I saw, no evidence remains. Yet I know the truth. Someone or something entered the cabin repeatedly, with patience, with intent, and I cannot rationalize it away. The ordinary lock, the simple door, had been no barrier at all. I survived. That is true. But survival is hollow in this case. Every door I lock now, every window I secure, carries a shadow of doubt. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind against the house, evokes the sensation of observation, the awareness that control can be exercised without presence, without notice. I have learned that solitude in the wrong place invites dangers beyond comprehension, patient and precise, capable of entering without leaving evidence. The cabin stands still in my memory, unoccupied, dark, silent. And yet I feel it whenever I imagine the forest, the slow, deliberate turning of a latch, the weightless presence just beyond vision, the certainty of a watcher who moves unseen. I will not return. I cannot. And I understand, with cold clarity, that some intrusions are invisible, some predators operate without leaving footprints, and some doors, no matter how securely locked, cannot keep what wants entry from slipping through. Story 8: The Silent Follower. I had been driving the late-night delivery route for nearly 3 years, and until that night, it had always been routine: a van, a clipboard, a GPS, and empty roads illuminated by streetlights and the occasional neon glow of a distant sign. The city had a quiet edge after midnight, a combination of deserted streets and sleeping neighborhoods that gave a false sense of peace. I liked it, even if it made me tired. The roads were mine for a few hours, a time to think without interruption. The first few stops of the night were uneventful. Parcels slid smoothly from the van to the doorsteps of silent houses, each delivery greeted by the echo of my own footsteps against concrete and asphalt. The air smelled faintly of rain from the evening storm, still clinging to the asphalt, and the hum of the van's engine was oddly comforting. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting uneven pools of light across the sidewalks. Shadows of trees stretched across the road, bending slightly in the occasional breeze, but nothing seemed out of place. It was the fourth delivery, a small apartment building on a quiet street, when I noticed someone. A figure walking along the opposite side of the road, far enough away that I assumed it was coincidental. The figure's pace was slow, deliberate, almost casual, and at first I dismissed it as a late-night wanderer. I parked the van, grabbed the parcel, and approached the building. I glanced over my shoulder, and the figure had moved forward, still walking in the same direction, still aligned roughly with my movements. I shook my head. People walk at night, it's not unusual. But the rhythm unsettled me. The figure seemed to adjust pace in response to mine, slowing when I paused, accelerating when I resumed. I chalked it up to coincidence, the natural ebb and flow of someone walking nearby. I delivered the package, signed it off, and headed back to the van. When I glanced toward the street again, the figure was there, maintaining distance but perfectly in line with my route. Driving away, I rationalized. Maybe someone lived on that street and was heading home. The city was empty. Perhaps it was a jogger late from work, a shift that ended unusually late. Yet no buildings, no lights from windows suggested occupancy. The street was silent, save for the engine and occasional hum from a distant transformer. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel, the unease growing in my chest like a slow, insistent pressure. By the next delivery, the figure was closer, still walking parallel to me along empty streets. I considered stopping, asking if the person needed help, but the thought of confrontation made my stomach turn. Rationality struggled against the creeping dread. Someone walking at night, along empty roads, matching my every turn and pause, was not normal. I tried to focus on the task, glancing briefly over the dashboard mirror. The figure's face was indistinct, features obscured by shadows, the hood of a jacket drawn up. Every movement seemed deliberate, measured. I sped up slightly, trying to shake the sense of being followed. The figure kept pace. I slowed, hoping it would move past, but it lured me again. My pulse quickened, the quiet night now oppressive, thick, alive with something unspoken. Rational explanations frayed further. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life along the sidewalks, no ambient noise to explain the persistence. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the empty streets had become a stage where someone else controlled the timing, the pace, the awareness of my every movement. Deliveries continued, but my attention was consumed entirely by the figure. I imagined all sorts of ordinary explanations, perhaps a neighbor, a wanderer, someone lost, but none fit the precision, the deliberate following. Fear began to root itself in every motion, each glance into the rearview mirror revealing that same distant silhouette, patient and unhurried, always aligned with my route. My rational mind recoiled, attempting to reason. It's coincidence, it's nothing, yet the evidence nodded certainty. By the time I reached the last stop, the sun had begun to hint at its arrival on the horizon, a thin smear of orange along the horizon, though it did nothing to calm the tension. The figure had been there the entire route, steps measured, pace deliberate, always keeping an exact distance. I parked the van, hands shaking, and watched. The figure paused briefly at the corner, then turned and disappeared into the shadows as silently as it had appeared. I exhaled, the relief sharp but uneasy. The roads were empty again, but the memory of measured steps, of patient, deliberate observation, had etched itself into my mind. Even as I drove home, streetlights blinking past, I could feel that presence lingering in the periphery of perception, patient and deliberate, proof that solitude on empty roads could be an invitation. The next night, I tried to dismiss the previous evening as a trick of tired eyes or an overactive imagination. But the roads were the same, empty, dimly lit, silent except for the engine of my van. I checked my mirrors constantly, anticipating nothing yet expecting the figure. Every turn, every intersection, every dimly illuminated corner became a potential point of observation. My pulse was taut with tension, and a tight knot of dread settled deep in my chest. The first few deliveries were uneventful. I parked, left packages, and returned to the van, trying to convince myself that what I had seen was coincidental. Yet as I drove down a narrow residential street, I caught movement in the periphery. A figure, hood up, walking along the edge of the road. My stomach tightened. It moved steadily, methodically, keeping pace with the van, maintaining a distance that was neither threatening nor casual. The air felt colder, heavier somehow, every breath carrying a weight that made my chest ache. I considered stopping, asking if the person needed help, but a primal caution froze me. Rational thought competed with instinct. It could be anyone, just a lone walker. But the precision of its movements was wrong. It mirrored every adjustment I made to speed, every turn I executed. I slowed, it slowed. I turned a corner, it was still there, following, patient and unhurried. The city, which had seemed empty before, now felt oppressive, as if the streets themselves were complicit in my isolation. I tried to call someone, anyone, to break the tension, but reception was spotty in this part of town. The radio offered only static and faint music from distant stations, failing to fill the void. I drove faster, heart hammering, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. The figure adjusted with ease, never running, never approaching, yet undeniably following. My rational mind wrestled with the fear. Could it be a prank, a coincidence, or something worse? Every instinct screamed that this was deliberate, that I was being observed and tested. Deliveries became exercises in hypervigilance. I approached doorways with caution, scanning the street before leaving parcels. Every shadow, every faint rustle of leaves, every distant thump sounded amplified, threatening. The figure never approached, never revealed intent beyond the act of following. It seemed to study me, understanding my patterns, my pauses, my routes, the same way a predator tracks prey, patient and precise. Rational explanations continued to fail. No other people were visible, no lights and houses indicated occupancy. I was alone, or so I thought. By midnight, exhaustion mixed with fear, and I found myself at a crossroads, confront or evade. I chose caution, turning onto side streets I didn't normally use, doubling back, hoping to lose the follower. Yet as I glanced in the rearview mirror, there it was, always aligned, always maintaining the same measured distance. My pulse thundered in my ears, hands trembling uncontrollably. I felt trapped, a puppet on strings held by a presence that did not reveal itself yet dictated my movements. The final deliveries of the night were surreal exercises in paranoia. I walked briskly to doorsteps, scanning constantly, flashlight and clipboard in hand. The figure remained, visible only intermittently, stepping with precision. The rhythm of its movement mirrored mine with a disconcerting accuracy that made every rational explanation impossible. I realized, fully, that this was no coincidence. I was being stalked, tested, hunted in a manner that required patience and deliberate observation. By the time I returned to the van for the last time, the first hints of dawn were streaking the sky, pale orange cutting across the horizon. The figure paused at a corner, standing still now, waiting as if to mark the end of its silent vigil. I exhaled sharply, feeling a fleeting relief, yet aware that the encounter was far from ordinary. Its presence lingered, a weight in my chest that persisted even as the empty streets receded behind me. I could not see it anymore, yet I knew it would return, patient, deliberate, and relentless. The third night was unbearable. Sleep had fled, my mind replaying the figure's measured steps, its patient pursuit, the way it had mirrored every movement along the empty streets. I resolved to finish the route, but with extreme caution. I left the van running as I approached the first delivery, eyes scanning the sidewalks, shadows twisting unnaturally in the dim streetlights. Every instinct screamed that I was being watched, that the figure could appear at any moment, but rationality offered no guidance. There was no precedent for this. By the second stop, I glimpsed it again, standing silently at the edge of a cul-de-sac, hood drawn, face obscured. The moment I froze, it began walking, keeping exact pace with my van. I gritted my teeth, hands shaking on the wheel, heart hammering in my chest. Panic threatened to override every thought, but I forced myself to drive, maintaining speed yet scanning constantly. The figure was patient, relentless, the embodiment of calculated observation. Rational explanations failed completely. No ordinary human could have maintained this synchronization so precisely without alerting me earlier. I tried to shake it, weaving through narrow streets, cutting across lanes, even doubling back. Still, it was there, step for step, always aligned, always just beyond reach. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, but I could not dismiss the evidence. I was being stalked, relentlessly, deliberately, without a word, without a sound beyond the soft rhythm of footsteps echoing against asphalt. The city had emptied into silence, leaving only the two of us and a tension thick enough to taste. By midnight, desperation overrode caution. I pulled into a dimly lit parking lot, the van engine idling, and stepped out, flashlight and clipboard ready. The figure paused at the far edge, unwavering. I tried shouting, demanding an explanation, but my voice sounded feeble, swallowed by the still night. The figure did not respond. Its movements were minimal, deliberate, almost ritualistic. I realized fully, with a chill that sank into my bones, that confrontation would not elicit a reaction. It was not seeking engagement, only observation. Adrenaline surged. I backed toward the van, heart racing, senses on high alert. The figure began moving again, maintaining pace as I scrambled inside. The van's engine roared to life. I accelerated, tires screaming slightly on asphalt, weaving through empty streets in a desperate bid to escape. Yet in the rearview mirror, I could see it, faint and deliberate, moving with impossible timing. Fear became acute, raw, the kind that leaves your body trembling even as rational thought struggles to assert itself. Finally, I reached a main road, wider and busier, where a few other late-night vehicles moved past. The figure paused at the intersection, watching silently as I accelerated past. Relief surged, but it was fleeting. I could not shake the impression of its patience, the certainty that it had been waiting, following, calculating. By the time I returned home, lights of familiar buildings glowing in the distance, the sensation of being observed had not dissipated. The streets were no longer empty, yet the memory of that precise, deliberate stalking lingered like a shadow pressed against my mind. Weeks later, the event haunts me. I avoid night deliveries whenever possible, yet the recollection of measured steps, patient pursuit, and silent observation is vivid. Rational explanations continue to fail. Whoever or whatever followed me operated with uncanny precision, knowledge of my habits, and absolute patience. I survived the night, completed my deliveries, yet the experience has left me fundamentally altered, hyper-aware, cautious, and painfully conscious of how solitary moments can be invaded without warning. The figure remains a presence in memory, not physical but persistent, a reminder that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that someone can track, observe, and manipulate from a distance without notice, patience being its weapon. I survived, yes, but every empty road, every night drive, carries the weight of awareness that patient, silent followers exist, and solitude, once comforting, can quickly become terrifying. I know now that some observers need not reveal themselves to control entirely. Story 9: The Envelope. I used to think of my flat as a sanctuary. It wasn't luxurious by any means, just a modest second-floor space on a quiet street, with thin walls that let in the muffled sounds of neighbors' televisions and the occasional bark of a dog in the courtyard. But it was mine, and after long days at work, I could come back, close the door, and let the outside world stay firmly outside. That's what I loved most, the threshold. Crossing it meant safety. Or at least, it used to. The night it started had been utterly ordinary. I had returned from the supermarket with a bag of groceries, walked up the dim stairwell lit by a flickering bulb, and fumbled with my keys at the door. The building smelled faintly of damp plaster, as it always did, and somewhere downstairs I heard someone laughing too loudly into a phone. Inside, the flat was warmly familiar. I unpacked pasta, tinned soup, a bottle of cheap wine, and settled into my usual routine, cooking, eating while half watching television, and then tidying up before bed. It was just after midnight when I heard the sound. A faint scrape, like paper against wood, coming from the direction of the door. At first I assumed I had imagined it. The heating pipes sometimes groaned and clicked, and noises carried oddly through the building. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I muted the television and listened. Nothing. Just silence, thick and still. Eventually I shrugged it off, though unease prickled at the back of my neck, and I told myself I was being foolish. The next morning, as I left for work, I noticed the envelope. It was lying flush against the inside of the door, as if someone had pushed it through during the night. My name wasn't written on it, no markings at all, just plain, white paper, sealed neatly. I frowned, picked it up, and turned it over in my hands. Junk mail usually came through the letterbox in the lobby, never slipped under my actual flat door. A neighbor, maybe? Someone who didn't want to knock. Inside the envelope were photographs, printed on glossy paper, slightly grainy, as if taken with an old camera or a cheap phone. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at: a darkened street, blurred outlines, patches of light. Then recognition hit me with a jolt that made my stomach clench. They were of my building. My windows. My door. The angle was unmistakable. Whoever had taken them had been standing outside on the pavement, directly opposite. One photo even caught the faint outline of me through the curtains, reading in my armchair. I froze there in the hallway, heart hammering, staring at the pictures with growing disbelief. Someone had been outside, photographing me in my home. A prank? That was my first thought. Some twisted neighbor with a cruel sense of humor. But the photos didn't feel like a joke. There was nothing staged or playful about them. They were flat, clinical observations rather than gestures. On the bus to work, I kept replaying it in my head. Rational explanations jostled for dominance, maybe a misdelivered envelope? But no, the photos were undeniably of me, my flat, my window. Someone had stood there, in the cold and dark, and watched. The thought turned my stomach. That evening, I told myself I'd laugh about it later. I even considered showing the photos to a colleague, framing it as some strange mystery. But when I returned home, the last of my good humor vanished. The stairwell felt oppressive, every creak of the steps exaggerated. I double-locked my door for the first time in months, then sat with the envelope on the kitchen table, staring at it as though it might explain itself. Hours passed. I tried to watch television, but the laughter tracks grated on my nerves. I tried to read, but the words blurred. My eyes kept drifting to the curtained window, expecting to see a flash, a figure, a shape lingering where the photographer had stood. At one point I thought I heard footsteps outside, measured and slow, but when I finally gathered the courage to peek through the blinds, the street was empty. By the time I went to bed, every instinct in my body screamed that I was no longer alone in my own space. Sleep came reluctantly, thin and restless. When I woke at dawn, my first thought was of the door. I scrambled out of bed, barefoot, and checked. Locked. Still locked. Relief spread through me, but it was shallow, temporary. That relief shattered when I looked down. Another envelope lay on the floor. Identical to the first, plain, white, sealed. My stomach twisted, my breath caught in my throat. With trembling fingers I picked it up and opened it. Inside were more photographs. These were closer, sharper. One of me unlocking my door the previous evening, groceries in hand. One of me through the kitchen window, head bent over the counter. And one, oh God, one of me asleep, half visible through a sliver in the curtains I must have forgotten to draw completely shut. The air left my lungs. I dropped the envelope and staggered back, my body trembling violently. Whoever was taking these hadn't just been outside the building, they had been right there, directly opposite, watching every movement, every careless habit. I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence, couldn't rationalize it as a prank. The precision was too intimate. And as I stood there in the pale morning light, clutching the envelope with cold, shaking hands, a thought arrived that hollowed me out entirely. If they had been close enough to take that photograph of me sleeping, what was to stop them from crossing the street, climbing the stairs, and slipping more than an envelope under my door? I spent the afternoon trying to invent explanations that would soothe me. Maybe a neighbor had seen me through the window and slipped the first set of photos under the door as a crude warning. Maybe someone on my street had a hobby with an inconveniently intrusive bent. I told myself things practical, rational things that made my pulse slow for a moment. The building faced a narrow pavement, a perfectly ordinary spot to stand with a camera. The photos could have been taken from across the road where a curious passerby lingered. But explanations only lasted until I examined the pictures again. The angles were wrong for a position in the middle of the street. The crane on the glossy print suggested a handheld camera aimed from inches, not meters, away. The photograph of me asleep had been taken through the slit between curtains where one crease caught the window light. It would have required either a long, precise lens, unlikely on a cold night in a residential street, or someone absurdly close and patient. Someone who knew why I did what I did. I called the police. The dispatcher was procedural and mildly sympathetic. I handed my trembling phone across the kitchen counter as if the act might order my thoughts. An officer came out about an hour later, young and apologetic, shoes crunching on the stairwell like small, insignificant sounds. He listened carefully, took the photos from me with gloved hands, and promised to check the area and speak to neighbors. He even left me a note with a case number scrawled on it, a small strip of paper that should have felt reassuring. They found nothing. No footprints in the thin mud by the pavement, no CCTV footage in the block that showed a figure loitering opposite my window. Bizarre, the officer said, voice flat with bureaucratic disinterest. We'll log it, keep an eye out. His words offered a shape like consolation, but the warmth of them did not spread. The facts were immutable. Someone had been close enough to photograph me sleeping, and then had returned the images, deliberately and anonymously, into my living space. I bought curtains with a thicker weave that afternoon and installed them with shaking hands. I took down the net curtains that had allowed that sliver of vision. I checked locks until my knuckles ached. Each precaution was practical and necessary, but also performed with the desperate hope that action could substitute for knowledge, that prevention could erase what had been seen. For a few nights the curtains were a talisman. I slept fitfully and woke with my palms damp, but at least the photographs stopped arriving. Then, 3 nights later, I found something else under the door, a small scrap of paper, folded twice. My hand hovered above it for a long time before I forced myself to pick it up. Inside was a single sentence, typed in block letters, clinical and calm, you're safer inside. No name, no case number, no flourish. Just those words, as if someone had paused and decided these 3 words were the most important to communicate. I sat on the kitchen floor and read them until the letters blurred. The words could be read in many registers. A warning, a taunt, protection, predation disguised as concern. Each reading made my stomach constrict anew. I wanted to scream, to run out to the street and look for anyone standing with a camera, but each instinct to act was snuffed by the petrified certainty that action might precipitate whatever the note hinted at. I began to test behaviors. I left lights on, then off. I drew curtains tight, then opened them to jolt my routine into unpredictability. I started taking different routes home from work, lingering in shops, circling the block just to see if a person would materialize where someone might stand to film me. Once, under the jaundiced glow of a newsagent sign, I saw a figure across the road, brief, like a smudge of shadow, and my heart leapt so hard it felt as if it would burst. I squinted, phone in hand, and the figure dissolved into an empty pavement before I could move. Days bled together into a slow, anxious wash. I watched my reflection in windows as if expecting the face of the watcher to appear behind mine. Friends started asking if I wanted them to stay over. I declined because the shame of being watched felt both too intimate to share and too humiliating to expose. At night the photographs rotated in my mind, a catalog I couldn't unsee. I imagined the shudder of a camera, the cold click, the smell of wet pavement, someone standing motionless in the dark placing the envelope as if obeying a ritual. Then, one evening, I came home to find the flat neat in a way that made my breath catch. It wasn't merely tidy, it had been arranged. The kettle sat centered on the stove, mugs lined up on the draining board, cushions aligned at precise angles on the couch. I stood in the hallway and felt the air thicken. Someone had entered, had moved through my rooms, and had taken the time to order my possessions. On the kitchen table, placed like an offering, was a photograph I hadn't seen before. It showed my front door, my door, from an angle that could only have been taken from inches away in the hallway. The brass knob gleamed, the chain unhooked. Across the top of the glossy paper, in handwriting that was unmistakably my own, someone had written the words, "You're safer inside." I called the police again, voice thin. They came, polite and efficient, and walked through the flat with gloves and flashlights, eyes scanning but finding nothing, no forced entry, no footprints, no paperwork to pin down the intrusion. The officer advised staying with a friend for a few nights. I agreed, because action distracted from terror. Still, as I turned the lock and slid the deadbolt that night, the typed sentence echoed in my head, "You're safer inside." I didn't sleep at my flat for nearly a week. A friend let me stay in her spare room, and I told her half the truth, that there had been a break-in, that someone had left things in my home. I didn't mention the photographs or the notes. Saying those details out loud would have made them too real, too damning. In her flat, I tried to rest, but even there I checked the curtains obsessively and jolted awake at each small noise in the hall. On the 6th night I decided to return. I convinced myself the intruder had made their point, whatever it was. Perhaps they had tired of the game, moved on. Maybe the rearranged flat and the handwritten words were the crescendo, the end of their cruel little theater. I told myself these things, though none of them felt solid. They were scaffolds I built to support a return to normality. When I stepped back inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. No cushions disturbed, no mugs aligned, no strange objects in view. Relief mingled with dread. The air smelled stale, as if the flat itself had been holding its breath. I checked every room, every closet, every shadowed corner. Empty. Utterly empty. That night, I forced myself into routine. A meal, a glass of wine, a book. I drew the new curtains tightly and double-locked the door. As I settled into bed, I repeated to myself, "It's over, it's over." I woke just after 3 to the softest sound, the scrape of paper against wood. My body snapped awake, adrenaline flooding so quickly I felt nauseous. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. I didn't need to check. I already knew what I would find. Still, I rose, trembling, and walked barefoot to the door. Another envelope waited in the dim light of the hallway, perfectly square against the mat. I bent, picked it up, and carried it to the table as though it might detonate in my hands. For a long moment I just stared at it, pulse hammering, before finally tearing the seal. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me, lying in bed, moments ago. The bedside lamp off, curtains closed, duvet pulled to my chin. The image was impossibly sharp, impossibly recent. My breath caught in my throat. I turned instinctively toward the window, even though the curtains were shut tight. That was when I noticed the other detail in the photo, something I had missed in the first glance. Behind the sleeping version of myself, just at the edge of the frame, was the silhouette of a person standing in the corner of the bedroom. Tall, unmoving, their features swallowed by shadow. The room spun. My stomach clenched with sickening clarity. The photographer hadn't been outside. They had been inside, in the same room, close enough to capture me in sleep. The curtains, the locks, the barricades, they had meant nothing. I bolted from the table, grabbing my phone with shaking hands, but the screen slipped through my sweat-slick fingers and clattered to the floor. Before I could snatch it up, the silence of the flat broke with the creak of floorboards, slow and deliberate, from the direction of my bedroom. I froze, throat constricting, unable to scream. Another creak. Then another. The steps were measured, purposeful, advancing down the short hallway toward me. Every survival instinct screamed to run, but the flat had only one exit, the front door, behind me. The footsteps drew closer, steady, unhurried, as though the figure knew I had nowhere to go. I forced myself to move, tearing the chain free, twisting the lock with fumbling hands. The door swung wide, slamming into the wall. I bolted into the stairwell, barefoot, nightshirt clinging with sweat. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Down the stairs, out into the street, the cold air hit me like a slap. I ran without direction, my breath sharp and ragged, until the lights of an all-night petrol station came into view. I stumbled inside, gasping, words tumbling out incoherently until the attendant called the police. They arrived swiftly this time, searched my flat, and found nothing. No figure, no footprints, no evidence of forced entry. But on the kitchen table lay the photograph I had seen, exactly as I had dropped it, proof of what I had witnessed. The officers exchanged looks I couldn't decipher, then advised me not to return until the investigation was complete. I didn't argue. I left the flat behind that night and never slept there again. Weeks have passed since, and I stay now with family miles away. I check doors, windows, curtains with obsessive precision. Yet despite the distance, I can't shake the certainty that I am still being observed. The memory of that silhouette in the corner, patient and silent, lives in me like a parasite. And sometimes, though I tell myself it's impossible, I still hear it. The faint scrape of paper against wood, a sound that doesn't belong, arriving in the quietest hours of the night. The police still have the photographs. They never found the intruder. But I know what the final message meant, carved through me like a wound. You're safer inside. Because outside, at least, I can run. Story 10, The Alley. I'd walked that alley 100 times before. It wasn't the prettiest route, cracked pavement, graffiti scrawled across the brick walls, the occasional stench of rot wafting from bins left too long without collection, but it was the quickest way home from the bus stop. After a long shift, shaving 5 minutes off my walk mattered. The alley was routine, unremarkable, a space that barely registered in my mind. That night had been ordinary in every other sense. The air was damp with drizzle, the kind that misted rather than poured, clinging to my jacket and dampening my hair. The city hummed around me, distant traffic, the faint wail of a siren, snippets of laughter from a bar 2 streets over. I remember thinking about what I might cook when I got home, running through the pitiful contents of my fridge, my mind detached from the walk itself. Halfway down the alley, I felt it. A brush, light but deliberate, across my right shoulder. As if fingertips had grazed the fabric of my jacket. My body reacted before my mind did. I flinched, spun, my breath caught halfway into a word that never left my throat. No one was there. The alley stretched behind me, empty, the weak glow of a flickering lamp casting long, uncertain shadows across the cracked pavement. A cat darted from beneath a dumpster, startling at my movement, but otherwise the space was vacant. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stood there, frozen, telling myself I must have imagined it. A trick of the wind. A strand of wet hair sticking to my neck. Something mundane. I forced myself to keep walking, though I found my pace had quickened. The drizzle thickened into rain, pattering softly against the bins, dripping from ledges. I shoved my hands in my pockets and told myself not to look back. Looking back would make it real. Looking back would confirm that something had been close enough to touch me. When I finally stepped out of the alley onto the brighter, busier street, relief washed through me in a dizzying wave. People passed by, umbrellas bobbing, cars whooshing past with wet tires. Noise, light, normality. I clung to it. By the time I reached my building, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. Just nerves, fatigue, the strangeness of walking alone at night. The next evening, though, unease returned. I lingered at the mouth of the alley, debating whether to take the longer route. Rain had washed the pavement clean, and the bricks cleaned with dampness under the lamps. Nothing unusual waited there, no figures, no movement, but a heaviness pressed against my chest. I told myself I was being ridiculous and stepped in. The same thing happened at almost the same spot. A faint, unmistakable pressure against my shoulder, fleeting but real. This time on the left. Again, I whirled, heart pounding, and again the alley lay empty behind me, stretching out like a throat-swallowing sound. My breaths came fast and shallow. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I had brushed against a hanging branch, but there were none. Maybe the drizzle had created the illusion of touch. Maybe. I hurried the rest of the way, nearly jogging by the time I reached the street. When I got home, I locked the door, tossed my jacket aside, and paced my flat in restless circles. I tried to laugh it off, tried to bury myself in television and noise, but the sensation lingered, the texture of invisible fingers against damp fabric, the instinctive certainty that someone had been there, right behind me. On the third night, I couldn't help myself. I left work later than usual, nerves already raw from exhaustion, and when I reached the alley I stopped in the middle and waited. My pulse drummed like a fist in my chest. The rain had eased, leaving only the glisten of wet pavement. I listened, really listened to the sounds. Distant traffic, the drip of water, the faint shuffle of a rat near the bins. Nothing else. I whispered, "Who's there?" The words felt absurd in the silence. They disappeared into the air as though absorbed by the bricks themselves. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then came the brush again, light and fleeting, across the nape of my neck this time. My body seized with cold terror. I spun, arms raised, teeth clenched, and saw nothing. Only the empty alley, patient and still. I ran. Not a hurried walk this time, but a full sprint, my shoes slapping wet pavement as panic clawed at my throat. I didn't stop until I had reached the bright main road, chest heaving, sweat mingling with rain. Passers-by stared at me, but their gazes felt safe compared to whatever lingered in that narrow passage. At home, I locked every bolt, shut every curtain, and tried to slow my breathing. Yet no matter how I turned it over in my mind, the experience wouldn't fit into reason. It hadn't been wind. It hadn't been imagination. The touch had been too precise, too familiar, as though someone had reached out deliberately to let me know I wasn't alone. For the first time in years, I left a lamp burning through the night. I tried to be rational. I really did. I walked the long way home the next night, circling blocks I normally never saw, timing my route so I could avoid the alley after dark. It felt ridiculous to rearrange my life around a brush on the shoulder, ridiculous and, in a way, cowardly. But routine was a strange kind of safety. Losing it made the world brittle. 3 days of detours stretched thin my patience and wallet. Ultimately, practicality shoved aside fear. The alley saved me 15 minutes. I kept telling myself I would take the long route next time. And then I found myself standing at the mouth of the alley again, arguing with myself about common sense until the light at the bus stop went green. That night I went prepared. I had a small torch, my phone recording, and a baseball cap shoved low so my neck wouldn't be an easy target. I walked slowly, headphones off, although I wanted music to keep my heartbeat company. The drizzle had left the bricks slick and shiny. The air smelled of wet concrete and the distant sourness of takeaway grease. I told myself to feel the texture of the world, the scrape of trainers on grit, the cadence of my steps. Rituals grounded me. Halfway down, the touch came, first clever, almost polite, like the ghost of a fingertip sweeping the seam of my jacket. I didn't flinch this time. I waited, breath shallow but steady. The torchlight swung, catching in the puddles. Nothing. I stopped and turned the phone camera toward the space behind me, fingers fumbling to hit record. The little red dot blinked. My own shadow loomed up, long and absurd on the brick. I stood there, heart loud in my ears, waiting for the expected sense of absence. The second brush was colder and broader, across my left shoulder like a palm laid flat. It lasted longer than the first, half a second, maybe a second, a time that felt stretched and obscene. I spun with the phone held out, voice caught in my throat. "Who's there?" The alley swallowed my question. Only the indifferent drip of a gutter answered. I played the footage back later with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The screen captured the dim tunnel of bricks, the bob of my own silhouette, the small halos of the streetlight, and nothing else. No hand. No stretch of sleeve. No distortion in the air. The sound was only my breathing, ragged and human. The rational part of me clung to the recording like a life buoy. If there was nothing on camera, I thought, there must be nothing to fear. But my skin remembered the contact more clearly than pixels ever could. I started making crude experiments. I left a strip of toilet paper caught on the lip of a bin, checked it for movement after midnight. I hung a ribbon from a low drain pipe and examined it each morning for odd smudges. I marked a line of flour across a shallow groove in the paving to catch prints. In each case, the evidence was maddeningly absent. The alley remained too clean in the morning. No footprints, no dragged smears, nothing to anchor the encounters to flesh and motion. Whatever brushed past me left no trace beyond sensation. I went further. I spoke to the man who tended the tiny kebab shop on the corner. He'd been there every night since I moved into the area, flipping meat beneath a persistent smell of onions and oil. He was a blunt man with patient eyes. When I told him about the touches, he shrugged, the kind of expression that held both sympathy and boredom. "Alley's got a history," he said, wiping a countertop. "Kids used it for dares once, years ago. Old man said a tram line used to run through there. People fall through the cracks, literal and otherwise." I pressed for more, tried to fish out gossip, something local to hang my fear on. He only added, "Just keep your head up, mate. Best not to give it anything to play with." That was barely consolation. The idea of history, of repeated crossings, of lives eroding away into small wayside tragedies made the place feel like an instrument tuned to attention. If it was a place that collected small things, maybe it made contact the way rough would catches lint. The touches multiplied. They learned me. The first time I noticed a faint chill along the back of my neck, I blamed the wind, but then a line of cold ran like ink from nape to shoulder, deliberate, like fingers tracing vertebrae. Another night the sensation moved diagonally, a pair of light taps beginning at my right shoulder blade and ending near my hip bone, as if someone had been walking a measuring tape along my back. Once, while I paused to fumble for my keys, I felt a pressure that wasn't quite touch but weight, someone leaning very slightly against me, just enough to tilt my balance, to suggest others' presence. I staggered forward and nearly tripped. I tried to name it. Phantom limb? Vertigo? Posture? None of the medical checks offered anything satisfying. My doctor smiled with professional politeness, suggested less caffeine, a sleep study maybe, and handed me a leaflet about anxiety. The leaflet landed like paper over a wound. At home, I changed my habits. Longer scarves, thicker collars, even a childlike habit of looking over both shoulders before stepping off a curb. Friends joked that I'd been watching too many horror films, that the city did something to the mind at night. Their laughter calmed me for hours at a stretch, but never for long. The touches were patient, they outlasted ridicule. A change happened without me noticing the night the alley learned to speak. It started as the faintest sound, fabric on fabric, just beyond my shoulder while I passed under the old advertising board. For a beat I thought it was the scrape of some stray bag against my coat. Then, impossibly, I felt a fingertip at my jawline. Not a brush, but a deliberate, almost intimate graze that made my bones hollow out with cold. I stopped dead, chest caving inward, and the alley seemed to lean in with me. I turned so slowly my knees protested, holding my phone up like a talisman. The torch flicked across brick and graffiti, across discarded wrappers and an abandoned bicycle, and there, at the edge of the camera's reach, impossible to see through electronic light, was the impression of 5 fingertips on the wall. They were not wet or smeared in any visible way. Rather, the mortar held a darker tone where the shadow of a hand had passed, a subtle difference in the way the damp had been absorbed. My breath came out in a sound that could have been both laugh and sob. I ran, the city swallowing me again with noise and light. But the mark stayed with me, a small, unignorable evidence that the alley had not been empty. That night, for the first time, I realized the contact was not random or playful. It was deliberate enough to leave impressions of touch, too precise for wind, too physical to be only imagination. When I returned the next day with daylight on my side, the fingertips had faded to nothing, like chalk washed by a careless hand. I felt cheated and relieved in equal parts. Cheated because the proof had melted, relieved because the mark was gone and perhaps the thing that left it had moved on. Then I learned it could mimic. I was halfway down, deciding whether to brave the shortcut, when I felt a soft weight settle on my shoulder, then, with surgical precision, a second weight on the other. Not a brush now, but 2 hands, warm, steady, as if someone had placed them there to steady me on slick ground. I turned slowly. The alley, in its wet and honest light, showed only its normal refuse, a tipped bin, a smear of graffiti, the Sunday morning sun warming bricks. No person. No shadow. I laughed then, a small, brittle sound, half in relief and half in hysteria. I did not laugh for long. As I watched, something impossible happened. The wet patch where the hand had rested spread across the stone like spilled ink, forming an imprint so clear I felt nauseous. The shape curved and splayed where fingers should be, dark against the light brick. My skin crawled at the realism of it. I touched the spot with a fingertip, cool and damp. It left no heat on my skin, only the knowledge of contact. I ran. Not to the bus stop, but back into the arms of my small, orderly life, where lamps burned late and curtains remained drawn. It should have been a containment, a refuge. Instead, I felt like a bullet ricocheting between safe places. I lay awake, palms damp, and imagined hands where there was only night. At dawn I returned, although I had no good reason to go. The imprint was gone, and the alley looked exactly as it always had, anonymous, forgettable, even at its worst kind of ordinary. Rationality offered the same cold comfort. Damp bricks change tones, sweat leaves traces, our minds make patterns and meaning out of randomness. But the pattern of touches had a logic that was not my own. It learned, it imitated, it left impressions and then erased them. It practiced. That evening, with rain threatening and the sky bruised, I stepped into the mouth of the alley determined to catch it in the act. I held the phone high, recording, breath deliberately calm. I walked to the midpoint and stopped. The air smelled of iron. My fingers found the lip of my cap as if to steady purpose and not fear. Then the pressure began, first a fingertip to the shoulder, then the slow tracing to the neck, then a presence moving across my back like someone counting vertebrae. I straightened, and the pressure grew until it felt like a hand sat there, not resting but claiming. I turned, muscles coiled, foam light slicing the dark. And this time, the feeling didn't fall away. It steadied. It settled with a finality that felt like a man taking his place. Not one brush then gone, but occupation. Something heavy and patient and utterly near pressed at my scapula. I saw nothing in the camera. I felt everything. The hands were colder than any human touch I'd known, and they flexed, as if testing the edges of my ribs. The alley hummed its usual city undercurrent. I knew, in a way I hadn't before, that the next move would not be mine. I tore myself loose and ran until my lungs burned and the streetlights blurred. I didn't look back. I knew I could not have seen it even if I had glanced. Whatever was in that alley worked at a remove from light and image, lively only in contact. When I finally stopped in the safety of my hallway, every muscle shaking, my phone buzzed with a single new notification, a short, silent video message from an unknown number. I opened it with hands that threatened to fail. The video showed the alley. It showed me, walking, the exact moment I'd felt the hands settle. There was no visible intruder, only the wet pavement, a distant bin, a dull smear of graffiti. But the vantage point was close, not like a CCTV from a pole, but as if the camera had been placed on the wall a few feet from where I stood. At the very end of the clip, for half a second, the camera shifted minutely, as if someone had leaned in to whisper. I deleted the video and then watched it again. The second time, as if in punishment for my weak curiosity, a whisper threaded through the silent footage when the phone's volume strangled to life. My name, said slowly, like a benediction or a threat. I don't know when my fear turned to an animal thing, something that needed to be out and moving. The alley had become a place where touch came from places sight could not reach. I began to feel watched in daylight too, as if attention that learned at night stayed on even when the sun rose. I stopped walking home at all times. I took buses, cabs, detours, anything that would keep skin away from dark bricks. And yet, there is a part of me that is drawn back, as if the alley is a wound and I am compelled to touch the scab. Tonight, I told myself, I would not be afraid. I would face it. I would set a trap. I would not go alone. I would not fail. I didn't say who I called. I didn't say what I was going to do. I only stood in my doorway and listened to the rain, knowing that whatever came next would be decisive. I called in a favor and I lied about the details. I told Tom only that I needed a witness, someone to stand under a lamp while I proved to myself I wasn't losing my mind. He showed up exactly as promised the next night, handsome, skeptical, helmet hair from a late shift, but when I told him the alley story his face shifted from easy humor to something tighter. He carried two things, a strong torch and a roll of painter's canvas I'd begged from a friend who worked in printing. I brought a bottle of flour and a cheap camcorder that could run on external power. We met at the opposite corner before dark, the gutters already murmuring with incoming rain. We set the trap with clumsy, clotted hands. I dragged the canvas along the stretch of wall where I remembered the wet handprints. Tom helped pin it high enough that anyone leaning would touch it. We sprinkled a line of flour on the pavement along the middle of the alley to catch prints and propped the camera on a crate angled down so it would show the lower half of anyone who walked past. The camcorder's red light glowed like a tiny, accusatory eye. I felt ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. "Promise me one thing," Tom said quietly as we finished. "If it touches you, don't try to grab it. Run straight to light." His voice was steady, but his fingers trembled on the strap of the torch. I promised. I should have gone home then. The rational part of me, the safe, sensible half that still believed in ordinary explanations, screamed that leaving would be the braver, saner choice. But there was a part of me that needed to know what I had been feeling every night for weeks. That part had become feral and patient. We waited under the street lamp like two stupid ghosts, breath-making small ghosts against the cold. The city's noise thinned, and the alley's bones showed themselves in detail, the scabbed posters, the bowed drain, the crooked drain pipe that had always leached a faint, mineral stain. I walked the same route once, twice, to tire the thing or draw it out, I don't know which. The first passes gave us nothing but the puddle reflections of lamp posts. On the third, the sensation began as a trickle along my left shoulder, almost polite, and then it widened into the weight I had come to dread. 2 hands settled onto me at once, one on each shoulder, solid and colder than anything human. They pressed, patient and heavy, as if someone leaned into me with the intent to stay. "Tom." I heard my voice sound thin and far. I turned abruptly and the torch beam cut the air. The hands didn't go. They flexed, exploring, an appalling familiarity in motion. My legs felt like rubber. I thought of Tom's admonishment and of the crate and camera, and then I ran. I ran on blind reflex, feet slapping flour and wet grit, and didn't look back until I'd broken into the light of the corner where Tom stood, torch like a halo. He took one look at me and the softness vanished from his face. "Did it?" he began, but his question died as we saw the canvas. The painter's drop cloth was smeared with a shape so precise it stole the air. Where hands had pressed, the canvas had soaked in dark, mineral moisture and left a negative of a human palm and palm print, 5 fingers splayed, the ridges and arch perfectly recorded in shadow. The flower line across the pavement showed a pair of prints that began at the same place and then stopped, as if someone had walked into the wall and vanished. The camcorder had recorded nothing but me, my shoulders, my panicked face, my feet striking the ground. No hands, no figure, only the brief dip of light as the torch swung. But the canvas was undeniable and my shoulders burned with the ghost of pressure where the hands had settled. We called the police with hands that shook. They came like rain, efficient, damp, official. They photographed the canvas, bagged it, took statements. The detective was older than the officers who'd visited months before, and his face, when he came back from the alley with a heavier flashlight, had something like recognition in it. "You said this started suddenly?" he asked, and I told him the timeline as if naming each night might chase the dread down a list. They didn't dismiss us. That afternoon the council padlocked the alley to pedestrian access and left notes wired to the chain. A forensics team returned the next morning with spades and a small JCB. I stood with Tom behind the barrier while men in orange jackets began to dig where the flower had shown only emptiness. I watched them strip the surface of brick and soil, watched the arc of the machine, felt the alley change as if a living thing were being excised. The smell that rose when they broke the subsoil, old, earthy, who knows how long trapped, made my stomach drop. They found bones 3 layers down, not in a neat grave but jumbled and broken like the remnants of things not properly put away. Teeth, fragments of cloth, a ring warped by time. The coroner said later there were at least 4 sets, different ages, different sexes. None were recent enough for easy identification, but they were human, and their placement suggested remains shoved into a void and covered without ceremony. An unrecorded collapse, bodies tucked away when no one noticed, a seam of the city where people had fallen and been forgotten. The detective used words I barely heard: unrecorded burials, historic collapse, civic oversight, and in his voice I heard the thing I had felt, a pressure of weight, a memory of hands, and the imprint of those who had been pressed into cramped earth and brick. They closed the alley for good after the excavation. The council put up plans to lay a proper barrier and to commemorate the dead with a plaque. They called in structural engineers and historians. The city's machinery spun, and in its wake it polished the alley into a tidy absence. People would walk a different route now. The corner kebab shops sold fewer late-night wraps. Life found ordinary rhythms again. For me, there was closure and a new kind of fracture. The pressure in my shoulders dissipated, but the scar tissue of fear and the bruise of memory remained. I went to the hospital to have my shoulders examined. There were no obvious injuries the doctor could measure, but he documented contusions real, physical bruise marks where the hands had pressed. He shook his head and said, "Something made contact." The police photographed them like evidence and matched the patterns to nothing modern. The canvas was archived. I slept the first night in weeks without the lamp. It was small mercy. I still avoid the cut through when I walk home, but not only for fear now. I avoid it because knowing the source changed the shape of the alley. It was no longer a living thing that reached at people for sport. It was a tomb condition. Old bodies compressed into new architecture, their history pressing up against skin, leaving shapes where hands might have been. The city had built over an ache, and the ache had learned to reach out. The alley was sealed, but the city is layered and patient. New projects will cover old stains. Sometimes at night I think I can still feel the brief ghost of pressure on my shoulder, an echo of the past resting against present bones. Mostly I remember the clay smell on the canvas with its negative palms, and how close the living had been to being folded into a scene without record. That night I stood at the barrier and watched the workers lower the last of the barrier fencing into place. The detective came over, a small, human figure with a thermos, and he said quietly, "We'd have missed them if you hadn't been persistent." I nodded, feeling foolish and enormous at once. He put the thermos in my hands as if it were metal. "You're not only safer inside," he said, and I realized the other meaning of the earlier note, the one I treated as menace. For those people beneath brick and soil, the only safety had been in being buried and forgotten. For the living, safety came from attention, from refusing to let the city cover things up. The alley would no longer brush strangers' shoulders when no one watched. The hands were not a predator at all, but a memory that had learned to press at the living like a question. I survived. They were found. The dead had names now pinned to a list and an investigation, a record in the city's file. Closure, perhaps, for something that had hung in my nights like an unbearable touch. I had believed, for a time, that what reached for me at night was beyond story. It was not. It was sorrow and consequence, the city remembering what it had lost, and in remembering it touched me. I kept the canvas photograph on my phone for reasons I can't fully explain, proof for myself that I had been right, that the feeling had not been mine alone. Sometimes I still feel a brush of air on my shoulder walking past other alleys, and I turn, heart hammering, until I remember which ones have been excavated and which are still quiet with the weight of things not yet named.